A crown is supposed to symbolize unity, but in England's blood-soaked history, it's been more like a cursed object, passed from hand to hand in a centuries-long family feud with rules no one agrees on. Fathers disown sons. Queens dethrone kings. Brothers march into battle not for honor, but out of spite. This isn't a monarchy. It's a dynastic demolition derby dressed in velvet and pearls, and every betrayal left a scar on the nation. These are the 25 royal feuds that didn't just shake the throne. They rewrote the rules of history. Before we dive into the first betrayal, take a second to subscribe, especially if royal chaos whispered through candlelight is your kind of thing. While you're at it, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Midnight in Manchester? Sunrise in Sydney? We want to know who's joining this slow descent into royal dysfunction. 1. King Edward the Confessor versus Earl Godwin of Wessex. Picture this. England, a land teetering on the edge of invasion, split loyalties, and fatal family dinners. The year is 1051, and on the throne sits a man with a crown and a conscience problem. Edward the Confessor, King of the English, lover of monks, hater of conflict, and entirely unsuited to rule a den of Anglo-Saxon warlords with more knives than patience. Across the court, glaring with the quiet fury of a man who has outlived 3 kings and still hasn't gotten the throne, stands Earl Godwin of Wessex, a noble so powerful his surname is basically England. Edward was a puzzle, half Norman by heart, all Anglo-Saxon by accident. Raised in exile in Normandy, he returned to England in 1041 with continental tastes and zero political capital. His court spoke French. His gods were quiet. His royal advisors were imported. And that's where the trouble began. Because while Edward may have worn the crown, Godwin owned the kingdom. Godwin wasn't just an earl, he was a dynasty. His children were married into every corner of the realm. His son Harold was rising fast. His daughter Edith was married to Edward himself, much to Edward's quiet displeasure. The old king preferred celibacy. Godwin preferred grandsons. You can imagine the tension. The first real rupture came in 1051 over a very small town and a very large insult. Edward's Norman friend and probable sycophant, Eustace of Boulogne, rode into Dover, picked a fight, and got his men killed. In retaliation, Edward ordered Godwin to punish the townspeople, essentially demanding that the most powerful earl in England brutalize his own constituents for the sake of a French outsider. Godwin refused. In royal politics, that's a bit like a general saying no thanks to a direct command in wartime, except worse, because Godwin had the army, the land, and the loyalty of the people. Edward responded the only way a conflict-averse king could. He called a council. It ended exactly how you'd expect when the king's friends wear silk and the earl's allies wear chainmail. Godwin was outlawed, exiled to Flanders, stripped of power, and forced to leave his family behind. Godwin waited. And like all good feudal enemies with grudges and sons, he came back, with ships, alliances, and a vengeance served cold by the North Sea winds. In 1052, he sailed up the Thames and parked his fleet in full view of London. No invasion, no bloodshed, just vibes. And a pointed reminder, you can exile a man, but not his reputation. Edward blinked. Godwin was reinstated. The Normans were quietly shuffled out of court. And for a brief, eerie moment, the balance of power settled, not on royal authority, but on mutual exhaustion. But here's where the real mystery starts. Because this wasn't just a pissing match between two egos. It was a slow-motion collapse of an entire system. Anglo-Saxon England, with its fragile web of earldoms, oaths, and council politics, couldn't survive 2 suns in the sky. Edward ruled like a monk. Godwin governed like a king, and stuck between them was the question that would outlive both men. Who gets to decide what England is? Godwin died in 1053, quite possibly while choking on bread, a rather poetic ending for a man who made his fortune feeding armies. But his legacy? That lived on. His sons, especially Harold, carried the family name like a sword. And when Edward died childless in 1066, Harold would seize the throne. A Godwin, finally king. For 9 whole months. And that, of course, is what made 1051 to 1052 matter so much more than a bar fight in Dover. It cracked the foundation of royal succession, introduced the creeping sense that kings could be challenged, and left the English throne coated in the fingerprints of a family that believed rule was earned, not inherited. The Norman court watched. The Norman duke took notes. Historians love to say this was a structural crisis. Succession, governance, the blurred line between monarchy and aristocracy. And they're right. But it was also something darker. Edward had no heirs. Godwin had too many. England was being pulled in 2 directions, toward the old landowning dynasties of the Danelaw and toward the future of continental monarchy. And nobody was steering. The irony? Edward the Confessor would become a saint. Godwin would become a shadow. And yet, it was Godwin's family, not Edward's, who would define the crisis of 1066. Because just as Edward finally breathed his last breath on the Feast of the Epiphany, 1066, his beloved court priest and successor designate, Harold Godwinson, stepped into the shoes his father had pried open. Which brings us to the second family feud that cracked the kingdom in half. Not Edward versus Godwin, but Harold Godwinson versus his own brother, Tostig. 2. Earl Tostig, Godwinson versus Earl Harold. Godwinson. Sibling rivalry is a tale as old as kingship, and usually ends in a fight over land, livestock, or parental attention. But in the case of Tostig and Harold Godwinson, the consequences weren't just a bruised ego or a ruined family dinner. Their feud contributed to the most consequential year in English history, 1066, the year England changed forever. And all because 2 brothers couldn't share a kingdom. To understand how we got here, you need to picture the Godwin family after Earl Godwin's death in 1053. Picture a dynasty that had clawed its way to the top of Anglo-Saxon society, whose children were essentially royal in everything but name. Harold, the eldest surviving son, inherited the earldom of Wessex, by far the richest and most powerful region of England. Tostig, younger but no less ambitious, was handed Northumbria, the wild and often sullen northern realm that made Wessex look like a sunny vacation spot. Now, Tostig was a sharp man, cosmopolitan, sophisticated, politically capable, and some would say, brutally efficient. He had spent time in Flanders and Denmark, married into continental nobility, and ruled with the kind of firm hand that might have worked better in Normandy than in Northumbria. Because what Tostig didn't grasp, or didn't care to grasp, was that Northumbrians hated strong-armed southern rule. They didn't want imported administrators. They didn't want foreign wives. And they certainly didn't want to pay higher taxes so Tostig could impress the king. Tostig's tenure was marked by a series of miscalculations that would have been comical if they weren't so catastrophic. He imposed harsh levies. He exiled northern nobles. He assassinated rivals, or stood by while others did. By 1065, he had managed to alienate virtually the entire Northumbrian elite. That October, the region snapped. The Northumbrian thanes rose in revolt. They stormed York, killed Tostig's supporters, and declared Morcar, a member of the rival Mercian family, as their new earl. And here's where the family feud ignited like a dry haystack near a torch. Tostig expected his brother Harold to intervene. After all, family was everything in Anglo-Saxon England, and Harold was the most powerful man in the realm, second only to King Edward, who by this time was increasingly frail and detached. Tostig believed Harold would raise an army, march north and restore him to power by force. Harold didn't. Instead, Harold did what every politically savvy heir does when his brother becomes a political liability. He cut him loose. Harold rode to Oxford and met the rebel thanes in council. He listened to their grievances. He brokered peace. And he agreed to their demand. Tostig would be exiled, just like their father had been years before. It was a decision that stunned the court and devastated Tostig. In one stroke, Harold had not only betrayed his brother, he had signaled that he was playing for the throne. Stability, not family loyalty, was the new game. And for Tostig, that meant only one thing: revenge. He fled to Flanders, then to Norway, then back to the shadowy world of exile politics, where every deposed noble becomes a wandering gun for hire. And that's when fate, or perhaps something more cynical, stepped in. In Norway, King Harald Hardrada, a legendary warrior king with a taste for glory and an eye on England, listened to Tostig's grievances and saw an opportunity. With Edward the Confessor dying and the English succession uncertain, what better time to invade? And what better native guide than a disgruntled English earl with a score to settle? And so, in September 1066, while Harold Godwinson was still consolidating power in the south after being chosen king by the Witan, Tostig returned to England, but not alone. With Hardrada's fleet at his back, Tostig landed in the north, seized York, and dared his brother to come and take it back. Harold responded with terrifying speed. He marched his army over 180 miles in less than 2 weeks, one of the most stunning forced marches in medieval military history, and caught the invaders by surprise at Stamford Bridge on September 25, 1066. The battle was vicious. Tostig and Hardrada fought with the kind of desperate courage that defines doomed causes. And they were, of course, defeated. Tostig was killed in the melee. So was Hardrada. The Norwegian threat was extinguished in a single day, but at a cost. Because even as Harold was mopping up the battlefield, word arrived from the south. William of Normandy had landed at Pevensey. Harold had no choice. Exhausted and battered, he turned his army around and marched south again. Less than 3 weeks later, on October 14th, he would die at Hastings. And with him, Anglo-Saxon England would die too. So yes, when historians debate the causes of 1066, they talk about dynastic claims, Norman ambition, and Viking opportunism. But under all that, there's this quieter, more intimate tragedy. A brother betrayed, a kingdom fractured, and a final year shaped by a feud that began not with an invasion, but with a council meeting in Oxford. Was Harold justified in abandoning Tostig? Most modern historians say yes. They argue Harold was playing the long game, preserving national unity, avoiding civil war, and diffusing a volatile region that could have undermined his claim to the throne. But in choosing peace with Northumbria over loyalty to his own brother, Harold also planted the seeds of the very conflict he was trying to avoid. There's something chilling about that the man who tried to hold the kingdom together ended up pulling the thread that unraveled it. That the last Anglo-Saxon king fell not just to a foreign army, but to the consequences of a family feud he thought he had ended. And Tostig? He's remembered mostly as a villain, or at best a tragic saboteur, too proud to accept exile, too bitter to forgive. But in another life, another world, he might have been king himself, or at least something more than a cautionary footnote. Instead, he became the first domino in the year that destroyed everything his family had built. And as the battlefield of Stamford Bridge cooled and the corpse of a rebel brother lay among the fallen, England took a breath, just one, before the Normans changed the story completely. But it would take more than a foreign conquest to define what English kingship would become. It would take a confrontation not just between families or brothers, but between crown and church, between sacred authority and secular ambition, between a king and his best friend. Enter Henry II and Thomas Becket. 2 betrayals in, and already the throne's looking less like a seat of power and more like a very ornate trap. If you're still with us, you're clearly one of us, so go ahead and subscribe for more late-night royal unraveling. And while your sense of time is still intact, tell us in the comments. Where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Let's see how far the crown's collapse has traveled. 3. Henry II versus Thomas Becket. At first, this was supposed to be a friendship story. Not the warm, comforting kind, but the medieval version, where loyalty is transactional, affection is political, and intimacy means you know where the bodies are buried. Henry II, young, brilliant, volcanic with energy, had just inherited a fractured kingdom in 1154. England was exhausted after years of civil war. Authority was weak. Law was optional. Church courts were swallowing royal justice whole. And Henry, barely in his 20s, wanted order. So he chose a man he trusted. Thomas Becket was not born for sainthood. He was born for court. A Londoner of merchant stock, sharp-tongued, impeccably dressed, and devastatingly intelligent, Becket rose fast. He became Henry's chancellor, his fixer, his enforcer, his right hand. Together they hunted, drank, laughed, schemed. Chroniclers loved to note how inseparable they were. Henry trusted Becket the way powerful men only trust those who know how to break rules efficiently. And then Henry made the mistake that would haunt English history for centuries. He made Becket Archbishop of Canterbury. In Henry's mind, it was perfect. His friend would control the church. Royal authority would finally reach into clerical courts. No more priests committing crimes and escaping punishment under ecclesiastical immunity. No more bishops pretending Rome mattered more than the crown. The church would be domesticated. Instead, Becket changed. Or perhaps worse, he revealed himself. Once invested as archbishop, Becket underwent what looked suspiciously like a moral awakening. He abandoned courtly luxury. He embraced clerical independence. And most dangerously of all, he discovered that defying the king gave him power no royal office ever had. The friendship imploded almost immediately. The core issue sounds technical, but was politically explosive. Criminous clerks. Clergy accused of serious crimes were tried in church courts, which were famously lenient. Henry wanted them tried in royal courts after ecclesiastical judgment. Becket said no. Not, let's negotiate. Not perhaps with conditions. Just no. This wasn't about legal nuance. It was about sovereignty. In 1164, Henry attempted to formalize his authority through the Constitutions of Clarendon, a set of customs designed to limit clerical independence and reassert royal oversight. Becket initially agreed, then publicly recanted. In medieval politics, public humiliation was a declaration of war. Henry exploded. Becket fled to France. And for 6 years, England existed in a bizarre limbo. A king ruling half a kingdom, an archbishop waging ideological war from exile, and the pope playing both sides like a bored chess master. Letters flew, threats followed, negotiations collapsed. Becket excommunicated Henry's allies. Henry seized church revenues. Each man escalated, convinced the other would blink. Neither did. In 1170, under pressure to stabilize the realm and secure the succession of his son, Henry allowed Becket to return. The reconciliation was hollow. They barely spoke. And when Becket resumed excommunications, this time targeting bishops who had supported Henry, the king finally snapped. What Henry actually said is lost to history. Chroniclers paraphrased. Some softened it, some sharpened it. But the meaning was clear. He wanted Becket silenced. 4 knights took the hint. They crossed the channel. They rode to Canterbury. And inside the cathedral, the symbolic heart of English Christianity, they confronted the archbishop. Becket refused to flee. He refused to submit. He refused to compromise. And in that moment, English kingship crossed a line it could never uncross. The killing of an archbishop by agents acting in the name, if not the direct order, of the king detonated across Europe. Becket became a martyr almost overnight. Miracles were reported. Pilgrimages surged. Canterbury transformed into sacred ground. Henry, once the architect of royal restoration, was now the king who had blood on the church's altar. The irony was cruel. Henry had not wanted Becket dead. He had wanted him obedient. Instead, he had created something far more dangerous. A symbol. Henry spent the rest of his reign trying to repair the damage. He performed public penance. He walked barefoot. He allowed himself to be ritually scourged. The king who once bent nobles and castles now bowed to moral outrage. Politically, Henry survived. Institutionally, the monarchy retreated. The church retained its autonomy. Royal justice stopped at the cathedral door, and every future English king inherited the lesson Becket carved into history. There are limits to power, and sometimes they are enforced by belief rather than armies. Historians argue endlessly about intent. Did Becket provoke martyrdom? Did Henry lose control of his words? Was this ideology or ego? But those questions miss the deeper transformation. This feud didn't just redraw church-state relations. It changed the emotional architecture of English politics. Kings were no longer just rulers. They were moral actors, subject to public judgment in ways no Anglo-Saxon king had ever been. Authority became conditional. Reputation became weaponized. And Henry learned something else, something more personal. Power, once divided, doesn't recombine cleanly. Because as Henry struggled to contain the consequences of Becket's death, another problem was growing closer to home. Not across the Channel, not in Rome, but inside his own family. His sons were watching. They saw a king forced to kneel. They saw authority humbled. They saw weakness where there had once been certainty. And they began to ask a dangerous question, one that would fracture the Angevin Empire from the inside. If a king can be defied by a priest, why not by his own heir? And so, as the blood dried on the stones of Canterbury, the next feud was already forming, this time not between crown and church, but between a father and the son he had crowned king. Henry II would soon discover that the only thing more dangerous than an enemy with principles is a child with a claim. 4. Henry II versus Henry the Young King and the rebel royal coalition. There's a special kind of curse reserved for kings who try to rule from beyond the grave. And in 1170, Henry II, brilliant, brutal, perpetually in motion, decided to tempt fate by crowning his eldest son while still very much alive. It was meant to secure the dynasty. It was meant to send a message to rival claimants and rebellious vassals across the Angevin Empire. It was meant to keep the family united under the unmistakable glow of legitimacy. It did the opposite. In June 1170, the Archbishop of York placed the crown on the head of Henry the Young King, a 15-year-old whose primary talents were jousting, spending money, and making bad decisions look charming. The ceremony was hasty, politically awkward, and, most importantly, unauthorized by Thomas Becket, who, even in death, still managed to cast a shadow over English affairs. The coronation sparked outrage in the church and confusion across Europe. But the true explosion came within Henry's own household. You see, Henry II had crowned a king. But he didn't give him a kingdom. Young Henry received no real power, no lands to govern, no armies to command. Just a title, a ceremonial seat at court, and the expectation that he would smile, wave, and wait, possibly for decades, for his father to die or get bored. The young king was not built for that. He had grown up watching his father command a vast empire that stretched from the Scottish borders to the Pyrenees. He had watched Henry II bend barons, outmaneuver popes, and outmatch enemies on 3 fronts. But he had also watched something else, the slow corrosion of trust within their family. Because in the Angevin house, blood wasn't thicker than ambition. It was just another kind of fuel. And so, in 1173, Henry the Young King rebelled. Not alone, of course. No prince mounts a civil war by himself. He was joined by his younger brothers. Richard, later the Lionheart, already a rising star in Aquitaine, And Geoffrey, slippery, charismatic, and endlessly opportunistic. The true mastermind, however, was their mother. Eleanor of Aquitaine, queen consort, duchess in her own right, and one of the most formidable women in European history, had grown tired of her husband's control. She backed her sons. She urged defiance. She made alliances. And she may have whispered into the young king's ear the oldest, most seductive phrase in politics: "You could rule better than him." The revolt that followed became known, rather tamely, as the Great Revolt of 1173-1174. It was anything but tame. It stretched across Henry II's empire, from Normandy to Northumbria. It was joined by King Louis VII of France, who just happened to be Eleanor's ex-husband, and still held a grudge. It drew in William the Lion of Scotland, who saw a chance to break English overlordship. It attracted barons in England tired of Henry's reforms and centralization. Even the Count of Flanders poked his nose in. This was a full-scale dynastic insurrection, made all the more maddening by the fact that it was personal. Henry II wasn't just fighting enemies, he was fighting his wife, his sons, his supposed heirs. It's easy in retrospect to see how it happened. Henry II was a genius of statecraft but a failure at family management. He trusted no one completely. He kept power close. He divided his lands among his sons but refused to let them govern. He manipulated their rivalries, played favorites, and punished defiance with humiliation. And in doing so, he raised a brood of princes who learned politics as blood sport, from the master himself. The military campaign was brutal and chaotic. At first, the rebels had momentum. Castles fell, mercenaries swarmed. Eleanor tried to cross from Poitiers to join her sons, and was promptly captured by her husband's men, beginning a 15-year imprisonment that would become legend. But Henry II, for all his personal flaws, remained a political juggernaut. He moved fast, divided the rebels, bribed where he couldn't fight, and exploited every crack in the coalition. In England, he defeated rebellious barons with his usual efficiency. In Normandy, he sowed distrust between the brothers. And in a moment of theatrical brilliance, he performed public penance at Becket's tomb, earning just enough moral sympathy to tip the church back toward his side. By 1174, the rebellion collapsed. Richard and Geoffrey surrendered. The young king came crawling back. Eleanor remained under house arrest. And Henry II, still very much alive, still very much in control, welcomed his children back with the cold, suspicious forgiveness of a man who expected to be betrayed again. And he was right. The feud didn't end in 1174. It just mutated. The young king continued to press for more authority, more resources, and more respect. Henry II, never one to forget a disloyalty, kept him on a short leash. In 1182, tensions flared. Again, more arguments, more broken promises, more threats. But the young king's health failed him before politics could. He died in 1183 of illness while campaigning in the south of France, having never ruled in truth, only in name. Henry II mourned him, but not for long, because by then, Richard had become the new problem. The Lionheart had ambitions, real ones. And the feud between father and sons would spiral on, culminating in yet another rebellion in 1189, this time led by Richard with the help of King Philip II of France. By that point, Geoffrey was dead, Eleanor was still under lock and key, and Henry II was a shadow of his former self. He died that same year, betrayed to the end. When they found his body, they discovered a list of traitors tucked among his effects. At the top of the list, his son, Richard. That's the legacy of the feud Henry began by crowning his son while still alive. He tried to secure the future, and in doing so, unleashed a dynastic arms race that consumed his entire family. The lesson was brutal. In a world where kings ruled by charisma and sword, splitting power wasn't a compromise. It was a provocation. And yet, buried in this story is a deeper mystery, The kind of paradox only monarchy produces. Why do kings, obsessed with legacy, raise sons who resent them? Why do princes, trained to inherit, always end up trying to conquer? Somewhere between admiration and envy, between filial duty and royal ambition, the bloodline frays. And it frayed again, almost immediately, because as Richard rose, another threat flickered at the edge of the family line. Not a son, not a father, but a nephew, a boy named Arthur of Brittany, who would test the boundaries of inheritance, legitimacy, and survival in ways that would haunt the crown for generations. 5. King John versus Prince Arthur of Brittany. When Henry II died in 1189, his empire cracked like old stone. His sons had spent so long trying to inherit it that by the time the pieces fell, nobody was sure who should be holding which piece, or whether there was even an empire left to inherit. The man who took the throne of England was Richard the Lionheart, fresh from rebelling against his father and already dreaming of crusades. But as far as dynastic stability went, the real problem wasn't Richard. The real problem came after him. Because when Richard died in 1199 without a legitimate heir, the old question that had haunted the English monarchy resurfaced in its most brutal form. Who has the better claim, the younger brother or the son of the elder brother? Enter King John, the youngest of Henry II's sons. Nicknamed Lackland because his father didn't originally grant him any territories, John was never supposed to rule. He was the spare among spares, always in the background, always waiting for a window to climb through. When his older brothers died, first Henry the young king, then Geoffrey of Brittany, then Richard, John finally had that window. He reached for the crown like someone grabbing a rope before the ship pulls away, but someone else had a hand on it too. Arthur of Brittany was the posthumous son of John's older brother Geoffrey. Born in 1187, Arthur was a child when Richard died, but that child had something John never would, a claim rooted in primogeniture. By the strict rules of inheritance, especially as understood in parts of continental Europe, Arthur, as the son of the older brother, was the rightful heir. John, as the younger surviving uncle, was a usurper in all but name. The realm divided almost immediately. England and Normandy largely backed John, pragmatically if not enthusiastically. But Anjou, Maine, and Brittany declared for Arthur. So did the French king, Philip II, who was always ready to sow discord in the Angevin ranks. Philip saw Arthur as the perfect tool, a legitimate puppet who could help him carve up the Angevin Empire and finally drive the English out of France. What followed was not a single clean conflict, but a slow-motion political and military collapse. John trying to solidify his rule in England, while Arthur and his allies made gains on the continent. The real turning point came in 1202, when Arthur, now about 15, led a campaign into Poitou with French backing. He besieged Mirabeau Castle, where John's mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, then in her 80s, was holed up. John, for all his political faults, moved with astonishing speed. He stormed Mirabeau, broke the siege, captured Arthur, and took him prisoner. It was the most decisive and perhaps final act of competence in John's troubled reign. And then, Arthur disappeared. That's not poetic license. He literally vanished from the historical record in 1203, a year after his capture. One moment, he's a prisoner in John's custody. The next, he's gone. No trial, no ransom, no formal execution. Chroniclers of the time whispered different versions. Some said he was killed trying to escape. Others claimed he was murdered on John's orders. One account imagines John drunkenly stabbing him in a fit of rage and then throwing his body into the Seine, only to have it washed ashore. The details contradict. The truth is lost. But the effect was unmistakable. John became, overnight, the king who probably murdered his teenage nephew. Whether or not he personally dealt the blow, the perception was enough. Arthur had been a figure of legitimacy, a symbol of dynastic continuity. His death, sudden, unexplained, and possibly treacherous, turned John from a disputed monarch into a suspect. Barons in France revolted. Allies deserted. Even those who had no love for Arthur suddenly found themselves wondering if John's crown was cursed. The territories of Anjou, Maine, and Touraine were lost. Normandy followed. By 1204, what had once been a vast Anglo-French empire had shrunk to just England and a few coastal outposts. The political consequences of Arthur's disappearance reached far beyond maps. In England, distrust of John began to simmer. The nobility, already uneasy with his style of governance, now saw a monarch who silenced rivals not through politics or law, but through vanishing acts. And more importantly, they saw a king who couldn't win wars, which, in the brutal logic of medieval kingship, was almost worse than fratricide. John's efforts to recover his continental lands consumed resources, raised taxes, and strained loyalties. He built a massive war chest, levied scutage, money paid in lieu of military service, and enforced feudal dues with unprecedented aggression. And the barons noticed. This wasn't just about Arthur anymore. This was about how a man becomes king and what he does to stay there. By eliminating his rival, John hoped to secure his rule. Instead, he created a ghost. Arthur's absence became more powerful than his presence. People claimed to see him alive. Others invoked his name in rebellion. He became a symbol of resistance, a patron saint of grievances against the crown. The problem wasn't that Arthur had died. It was that John had erased him. And nature, politics, and myth all despise a vacuum. Modern historians have parsed every letter, every scribbled chronicle, every diplomatic fragment to try to determine what happened to Arthur. The best answer is, we still don't know. And maybe that's fitting, because what matters more than the act is the shadow it cast. It's not just that John may have killed Arthur, it's that he seemed capable of it. In monarchy, perception is authority, and John's authority, by 1215, was barely holding together. The Arthur affair didn't just mark the beginning of his decline, it marked the moral turning point, when the English nobility began to see their king not as a flawed ruler, but as a dangerous liability. The same man who had alienated the church, bungled wars, and taxed without restraint had also allegedly murdered a boy who stood in his way. That wasn't just politics, that was rot at the center of the crown. And the thing about rot is, once it starts, you can't contain it. John's barons, fed up, cornered, and morally outraged, would soon take action. Not through rebellion alone, but through something more subversive, law. They would force John to kneel, not just in defeat, but in principle. Because if a king could disappear a prince, they reasoned, then what protection did anyone have? And so, in a meadow by the Thames, at a place called Runnymede, a new weapon would be forged, not a sword or a spear, but a charter, a document that would attempt the impossible, to bind the king himself to the law. But before the ink could dry, John would do what John always did, betray the peace. Because power, once threatened, doesn't surrender quietly. And thus the next chapter in the crown's unraveling began, not with a murder, but with a rebellion of the barons themselves. 6. King John versus the rebel barons. By 1215, King John was a man at war with everything that had once made kingship sacred. The law, the church, his vassals, and most dangerously, the myth of legitimacy. The disappearance of Prince Arthur had cast a long shadow over his rule. But the rot didn't stop there. It spread through his failed wars in France, his heavy-handed administration, and his increasingly erratic approach to power. England had seen bad kings before. It had even seen tyrants. But John was something else. A ruler who wielded authority like a cudgel, all while bleeding the land of silver and swallowing his own credibility, one tax at a time. The feud between King John and the barons was not a single explosion. it was a pressure cooker. One hiss at a time, England moved toward collapse. Unlike the dramatic, personalized feuds of his father and brothers, John's conflict was systemic. It wasn't about a rival claimant or a disobedient son. It was about how far royal power could stretch before it snapped. The barons, wealthy landholders who were supposed to be the backbone of the crown's feudal authority, had watched John pile insult upon injury. First, there was the loss of Normandy in 1204, which they blamed squarely on his ineptitude. Then came the heavy taxation, imposed not for national defense or public good, but to fund the king's personal attempt to retake lost lands, a dream that never materialized. Scutage, the infamous tax levied in place of military service, was demanded repeatedly and at escalating rates. It wasn't just about money. It was about being used, again and again, by a monarch who gave nothing in return. Then came the church feud. In 1207, John managed to alienate Pope Innocent III by rejecting the papal nomination for Archbishop of Canterbury. The Pope retaliated by placing England under interdict, a spiritual lockdown that suspended religious services across the realm. John responded the only way he knew how, by seizing church lands and daring the clergy to resist him. The Pope escalated further, excommunicating the king in 1209. For 5 years, England drifted spiritually and politically, untethered from Rome and increasingly isolated in Europe. It took a desperate gamble in 1213 for John to reverse course. Facing the threat of a French invasion, he submitted to the Pope, agreeing to make England a papal fief, effectively handing his crown over to Rome in exchange for protection. It was a stunning humiliation. The king who had once defied the church now paid it rent, and the barons took note. Not only could John not defend his own lands, he had mortgaged the sovereignty of the realm to save himself. By the start of 1215, England was brimming with discontent. The barons had petitioned, begged, and schemed. But now they began to organize. A group of leading nobles, many of whom had served under John and watched his failures firsthand, formed a coalition. They were not ideologues. They were not revolutionaries. They were, at first, traditionalists, men who believed that the king had broken the unwritten contract of feudal governance and needed to be brought back in line. Their demands were clear: limitations on arbitrary taxation, respect for property rights, fair treatment under the law, and adherence to custom. But John, unsurprisingly, met them with contempt. He made promises. He broke them. He raised mercenaries. He fortified castles. And when the barons saw negotiations going nowhere, they took the one step John had refused to imagine. They took London. In May 1215, the rebel barons seized the capital, a bloodless, almost anticlimactic coup that signaled a profound shift in power. John, isolated and increasingly cornered, had no choice but to come to the table. What followed was one of the most famous moments in English history, less for its drama, which was minimal, and more for its consequences, which were eternal. On June 15, 1215, in a meadow called Runnymede, John affixed his royal seal to a document known as Magna Carta. It was not a declaration of independence. It was not democracy. It was a list of feudal grievances dressed up as law. But it was revolutionary all the same. Because Magna Carta did something no English document had ever done before. It declared that the king was not above the law. Clause after clause laid out limits on royal power. The king could no longer levy taxes without consent. He could no longer imprison free men without due process. He could not seize property arbitrarily. He had to recognize the rights of towns, the church, and his subjects. Most radically, the charter established a council of barons to oversee the enforcement of these terms. If the king violated them, the barons could rebel, legally. It was, in effect, a leash for the crown. John never intended to honor it. Within weeks, he appealed to the Pope, now his theoretical overlord, to annul Magna Carta. Innocent III obliged, declaring the charter null and void, and excommunicating the rebel barons. John raised a new army and plunged the kingdom into civil war. The barons, now facing an open breach of peace, did the unthinkable. They invited a French prince, Louis of France, to claim the English throne. So ended the illusion of royal supremacy. A Plantagenet king had been forced to accept limits on his power, and when he refused to abide by them, his own nobles brought in a foreign invader to replace him. The First Barons' War was chaotic and morally scrambled. Neither side had clean hands. Louis arrived in England and was proclaimed king in London in 1216, even as John tried to regain the rest of the country through a mix of military force and desperate diplomacy. But fate intervened in a way no one expected. John died. In October 1216, retreating through the fens of eastern England, he contracted dysentery and expired in the middle of a collapsing war. He left behind a divided realm, a war-weary nobility, and a child, Henry, just 9 years old, crowned with a paper crown in Gloucester Abbey because they couldn't find a proper one. It was this unexpected death that saved the Plantagenet line. The barons, realizing that a child could be molded and reconciled, abandoned Louis and returned to the royal fold. Under the regency of William Marshal, Magna Carta was reissued, slightly modified, but essentially intact. The war wound down. The French left. The boy king survived, but the damage had been done. Magna Carta became more than a treaty. It became a myth. In the centuries that followed, it would be reinterpreted, rewritten, and reissued over and over. It was cited in the English Civil War, echoed in the American colonies, and held aloft by lawyers, rebels, and kings alike. Its original clauses may seem archaic, forest law, scutage, baronial courts, but its core principle endures: that no one, not even the king, is above the law. Modern historians like to remind us that Magna Carta wasn't a democratic document. It was a baronial negotiation tool designed to protect elite interests. That's true. But it's also true that, once written, its logic couldn't be contained. Like all great ideas, it grew beyond its context. And the feud that birthed it, between King John and his barons, wasn't a clash of ideologies. It was a last-ditch effort to salvage a crumbling system. A moment when the ruling class, staring into the abyss of royal tyranny, decided to risk the unthinkable, to make the crown answerable to its subjects. John didn't live to see the consequences of his failure, but every monarch after him felt them. And yet, history has a way of testing every idea. Magna Carta may have established the principle of limited kingship, but principles mean little when kings themselves refuse to learn. Because the next great feud would take that fragile charter and subject it to the ultimate stress test. Not between king and barons, not over land or taxes or war, but over the soul of royal governance itself. Henry III versus Simon de Montfort, when ideals of reform collided with the hard limits of royal patience, and Parliament was born from the fallout. 7. Henry III versus Simon de Montfort. If King John's reign was defined by collapse, his son Henry III's reign was defined by its aftermath, the long, awkward, often humiliating process of cleaning up the mess. John had died young and hated. Henry was crowned young and pitied. At just 9 years old, the child inherited a kingdom splintered by civil war, debt, papal manipulation, and baronial fatigue. He was, in many ways, a monarch created by Magna Carta, not just limited by it, but protected by it. A king on a leash, raised to believe that ruling meant pleasing. But Henry grew up. And over the 56 long years he wore the crown, he did what most kings eventually do. He forgot the lesson. At first, the early regency under William Marshal and later Hubert de Burgh maintained a kind of wary truce between king and barons. Magna Carta was reissued, courts reformed, and the realm gradually stitched back together. But as Henry came of age and asserted himself, he began to show his true instincts, not as a tyrant like his father, but as something almost worse in feudal politics, a dreamer. Henry wanted to be a king of Christian virtue, a restorer of the old order, a pious ruler in the mold of Edward the Confessor. He rebuilt Westminster Abbey, He spent lavishly on religious art, foreign marriages, and symbolic pageantry. He obsessed over the cult of saints and poured resources into church patronage. But none of this came with a corresponding gift for governance. He did not reform the treasury. He did not restrain spending. He did not respect consultation. Instead, he ruled by whim and sentiment. He gave vast sums to papal causes, funded disastrous military adventures, and surrounded himself with foreign favorites, a bitter sticking point for the native barons. His Lusignan half-brothers, invited over from Poitou, were granted lands and influence far beyond their merit. The Queen's Savoyard relatives were installed in key positions. Patronage became nepotism. Advice became flattery. By the 1250s, resentment had boiled over into outright opposition. The king's finances were in shambles. His attempts to fund a failed Sicilian campaign for the Pope, to install his younger son as king of a kingdom he would never touch, had alienated nearly every major landowner in the realm. Worse, he had repeatedly violated the promises of Magna Carta, summoning barons for council only when convenient, and treating royal authority as a personal inheritance rather than a shared institution. Into this increasingly unstable picture stepped a man who should have been Henry's greatest ally, but who would instead become his most dangerous enemy. Simon de Montfort was no mere rebel. He was the king's brother-in-law, married to Henry's sister Eleanor. A French noble by birth, he had carved out a prominent role in English politics through piety, charisma, and military skill. But what made Simon so dangerous wasn't just his proximity to the crown, it was his belief in constitutional principle. Montfort believed the barons had a right, perhaps even a duty, to restrain the king. He saw Magna Carta not as a temporary truce, but as a starting point. And when Henry's rule descended into fiscal chaos and political favoritism, Montfort emerged as the rhetorical spearhead of reform. The defining moment came in 1258. That year, Henry asked Parliament to fund yet another foreign campaign. The barons, exhausted by mismanagement and denied the promised reforms, refused. Instead, they confronted the king with a revolutionary proposal, the Provisions of Oxford. These provisions were radical by medieval standards. They created a council of 15 barons to oversee the king's decisions. They mandated regular parliaments 3 times a year. They limited the appointment of sheriffs and judges. The barons weren't merely advising the king now, they were governing alongside him. Henry had no choice but to accept. And so, for a brief and uneasy period, England operated under a form of proto-constitutional monarchy. It wasn't democracy, but it was a major shift, an institutional challenge to the divine right of kings, anchored in custom and collective oversight. But of course, nothing in medieval politics is stable for long. Henry, as was his custom, resented the limitations and sought ways to reclaim power. He appealed to the Pope. He exploited divisions among the barons. He waited for the momentum of reform to falter. And in 1261, he made his move, revoking the provisions and resuming personal rule with papal support. This led to civil war. The Second Barons' War, 1264 to 1267, was not just a conflict between two factions. It was a war about who had the right to define kingship. Was it the king, by divine sanction? Or was it the political community, through the precedent of law and consultation? Montfort answered that question with steel. In 1264, at the Battle of Lewes, he defeated the royal army and captured both Henry and his son, Prince Edward, the future Edward I. With the king effectively imprisoned, Montfort ruled in his name. For 15 months, England was governed not by a monarch, but by a baronial regime that claimed legitimacy through necessity. And during this period, Montfort did something truly unprecedented. He summoned a parliament in January 1265, and he invited not just barons and bishops, but representatives from towns and boroughs. It was the first time in English history that commoners, albeit wealthy, landowning ones, had been called to the national political table. This wasn't egalitarianism. Montfort wasn't trying to invent modern democracy, but he understood something elemental. If royal power had become too centralized, the answer wasn't just baronial oversight. It was broader inclusion. The towns paid taxes. The towns provided soldiers. Why shouldn't the towns have a voice? The idea of Parliament, as something larger than a king's council, had begun. But Montfort's regime was brittle. He ruled by emergency powers, lacked broad support, and had made powerful enemies. Most notably, Prince Edward escaped captivity in 1265, regrouped loyalist forces, and began to roll back the baronial coalition with swift, disciplined violence. At the Battle of Evesham in August 1265, Montfort was ambushed and killed. His body was mutilated, his authority dismantled, his reforms reversed. The baronial movement collapsed in the months that followed. And yet, the ideas Montfort championed didn't die with him. Even as the monarchy reasserted itself under Henry, and more forcefully under Edward I, the memory of 1258 and 1265 lingered. The precedent of regular parliaments. The notion that kings could be advised by a body that included more than nobles. The idea that accountability was not treasonous, all of it survived. Henry III himself died in 1272, remembered not as a tyrant or a visionary, but as a cautionary figure, a king who loved symbols more than statecraft, who embraced piety while ignoring governance. His reign was not marked by glory or conquest, but by the slow emergence of constitutional thinking. And Montfort? He became a martyr in some circles, a dangerous radical in others, and a political template for future reformers. His Parliament of 1265 is often called the first true English Parliament, not because it changed everything, but because it showed what change could look like. This feud between Henry III and Simon de Montfort wasn't just about personality. It was about the architecture of power. Could kings rule alone, or did they rule in trust? Could the past bind the present? Could laws evolve to reflect the consent of the governed? These weren't abstract questions. They were immediate, bloody, and politically explosive. And even as Edward I restored royal authority, he did so with a sharp eye on what had gone wrong in his father's reign. He institutionalized some of Montfort's practices even as he suppressed Montfort's legacy. Because the smartest kings don't just defeat reformers, they absorb their tools. Still, the question remained unresolved. What happens when a king doesn't just ignore advice, but ignores everything? His wife, his court, his nobles, even his son? That question would be tested with chilling clarity under Edward's own son, a man whose reign would unravel in humiliation and betrayal. Because next came a feud so personal, so degrading, that it would end with something nearly unthinkable in English monarchy. A king deposed by his own queen. And so we turn to Edward II versus Isabella of France, when marriage turned into mutiny and the throne itself became a hostage. 8. Edward II versus Queen Isabella and the Mortimer faction. Kings are rarely deposed in English history, and when they are, it's usually done under the camouflage of civil war or divine intervention, wrapped in the legitimacy of succession and soaked in the slow process of political decay. But Edward II's downfall wasn't a long, reluctant tumble from power. It was a dropkick from his own wife, a queen who abandoned him, invaded her own kingdom, and took the crown off his head without so much as a civil war. Which raises a question. How do you lose everything to someone you once kissed goodnight? To answer that, we have to start with what kind of king Edward II was. And the answer is complicated in the most frustrating way. He wasn't mad, cruel, or tyrannical in the traditional sense. He was rather spectacularly uninterested in the job of kingship and emotionally loyal to all the wrong people. Unlike his father, Edward I, the hammer of the Scots, the builder of castles, and the terror of barons, Edward II seemed to believe the crown was a social club where affection, not governance, was the main duty. At the heart of his early reign was one figure, Piers Gaveston. Gaveston was a Gascon knight of modest origins who became, in the eyes of Edward, more than just a favorite. Chroniclers debated the nature of their bond. Some called it brotherly devotion. Others suggested something more intimate. But whatever the truth, Edward elevated Gaveston far beyond what his station justified, showering him with titles, wealth, and control over royal patronage. The nobles hated him, not because he was foreign, though that didn't help, and not because he was lowborn, though they would never say so directly, but because he was clearly the power behind the throne, and he wielded that power like a man who knew he'd never lose it. They were wrong. Gaveston was exiled multiple times and eventually executed by a baronial faction in 1312, during one of the many episodes of upper-class vigilante politics that marked Edward's early reign. His death devastated the king, but it didn't teach him a thing, because Edward simply repeated the pattern. Enter Hugh Despenser the Younger. After Gaveston's fall, Edward filled the void with another favorite, more ambitious, more ruthless, and even more detested. Despenser, along with his equally conniving father, wormed his way into Edward's trust and essentially ran the kingdom through a system of extortion, land seizures, and judicial manipulation that made the barons nostalgic for the worst days of King John. As Despenser's influence grew, Edward's reign began to look less like a monarchy and more like a private feud with the rest of the nobility. By the mid-1320s, England was functionally divided into two groups, those who hated the Despensers and those who feared them. The Queen, Isabella of France, belonged to the first. Isabella had once been a political asset, married to Edward in 1308 as part of a diplomatic marriage between England and France. She was intelligent, fluent in courtly politics, and had provided Edward with multiple children, including the future Edward III. But by the 1320s, their relationship had fractured completely. Isabella was sidelined, Despenser-controlled, and increasingly treated like a liability rather than a partner. The tipping point came during Edward's disastrous campaigns in Scotland. His humiliating defeat at Bannockburn in 1314, where he lost not just the battle but the moral authority to call himself a war leader, left his reputation in tatters. Subsequent years of failed military campaigns, financial mismanagement, and Despenser-driven oppression drove baronial resistance underground. In 1325, when Edward needed someone to go to France and negotiate over disputed lands, he sent Isabella. It was a mistake of historic proportions. Once in France, Isabella refused to return. She claimed she couldn't rejoin her husband while Despenser still held power, a claim that, in the language of medieval diplomacy, was a direct accusation that the king had lost control of his own court. While in France, she aligned herself with Roger Mortimer, a marcher lord who had escaped imprisonment and become a leading opponent of the Despenser regime. And then she did the unthinkable. She began raising an army. With French support, disaffected English nobles, and the promise of a new future for the young Prince Edward, whom she had with her, Isabella landed in England in September 1326. There was no grand clash of armies. Edward and the Despensers fled, abandoned by their own supporters. The country, sick of misrule and terrified of the Despensers' revenge apparatus, welcomed the Queen. Within 2 months, it was over. Both Despensers were captured and executed, publicly and ceremonially, in ways designed to make clear that this was personal. And Edward? He was deposed. In early 1327, a parliament convened, an irregular one, but not an illegitimate one, and declared Edward unfit to rule. His son, the 14-year-old Edward III, was named king. The transition was justified on the grounds of incompetence and misgovernment. A polite medieval phrase for this man is a danger to his own throne. This was unprecedented. Not since 1327 had a reigning king of England been removed without a bloody civil war or foreign conquest. Edward's fall was accomplished with almost surgical precision, not because he was hated by the masses, but because he had alienated every pillar of support a king could depend on. The church, the barons, the urban elites, and even his own household had quietly abandoned him. And that leaves us with Isabella. History has not been kind or consistent with her. In later narratives, she became the she-wolf of France, a figure of ambition and betrayal. But in truth, her rebellion was not an act of vengeance, nor a grab for permanent power. It was at its core a revolution of necessity. The realm had become unstable under Edward's rule, and the crown had to be saved from the king. That doesn't mean what followed was clean. Isabella and Mortimer ruled in the name of the young king, but they quickly became as autocratic as the regime they'd overthrown. Mortimer enriched himself. Enemies were purged. Discontent rose. And in 1330, Edward III, now 18 years old, took matters into his own hands. He staged a coup, arrested Mortimer, and had him executed for treason. Isabella was spared, but sent into polite exile. Thus ended the brief experiment of queen-led government in England, a moment of both stunning success and profound instability. Isabella had done what few before her dared, removed a king. But her victory, like Edward's failures, had consequences that rippled for decades. Modern historians view Edward II's reign as a cautionary tale. He wasn't a monster. He was worse. A king who didn't understand power, but tried to wield it anyway. His personal loyalties blinded him. His disregard for baronial consensus crippled him. And his failure to adapt, to see the difference between authority and affection, cost him everything. And yet, just beneath the personal drama lies a deeper question. What is kingship, really? Is it divine right? Bloodline? Popular support? Military strength? Or is it something more fragile? A constantly shifting negotiation between monarch and subject, between image and reality? Because Edward II lost his crown not through battle, but through a collective loss of faith. He had the title, the resources, and the right. But the people around him, the people who mattered, stopped believing he should wear it. And that's the dangerous truth about monarchy. It looks absolute, but it survives on illusion. Once the illusion breaks, even the crown can fall off with a whisper. And if you think a cousin can't make that whisper into a shout, wait until you meet the next pair. One cousin, a paranoid king with a flair for cruelty. The other, an exiled duke with nothing to lose. Because next comes Richard II versus Henry Bolingbroke, the feud that would teach England the final lesson of medieval monarchy. That any king can be replaced, if you just call it inheritance. 9. Richard II versus Henry Bolingbroke. Power, in medieval England, wore a crown, but it walked on a knife's edge. Few kings knew this better than Richard II, the boy monarch who came to the throne at 10 and never quite figured out whether he was England's ruler or its prisoner. And few men exploited that confusion more effectively than his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, the calculating noble who transformed a royal grudge into a full-scale regime change. Their feud wasn't born in blood, but in betrayal. And it didn't just end in a deposition, it redefined what it meant to be a king. To understand why Richard's downfall shook the very idea of monarchy, you have to begin with how he inherited the throne. Richard became king in 1377 after the death of his grandfather Edward III, one of England's greatest warrior kings. But Richard's father, Edward the Black Prince, had already died the year before. That left the crown to a child, and child kings are dangerous creatures in medieval politics. They invite manipulation, raise questions of regency, and give ambitious uncles plenty of time to measure the throne. At first, things held together, barely. The kingdom was run by a council of nobles. The most powerful among them were Richard's uncles, John of Gaunt, Thomas of Gloucester, and other sons of Edward III who understood realpolitik far better than the boy king did. Meanwhile, the realm itself was strained by the 100 Years' War, the burden of heavy taxation, and a peasantry pushed to the brink. In 1381, when Richard was only 14, that pressure exploded in the peasants' revolt. A massive uprising swept through the southeast, fueled by fury over poll taxes and long-simmering resentment of aristocratic privilege. The rebels marched on London, killed royal officials, and demanded radical reforms, including the abolition of serfdom. And Richard, remarkably, faced them down. At Smithfield, he met the rebel leader, Wat Tyler, face to face. After Tyler was killed in a scuffle, Richard addressed the mob directly, declaring, "You shall have no captain but me." For a brief moment, the boy king looked like a born ruler, cool under pressure, commanding and, perhaps, touched by the divine. But the truth was more complex, because while Richard could perform kingship, he never learned to balance it. His vision of rule was theatrical, not constitutional. He saw himself as a chosen sovereign, a living embodiment of royal dignity, which meant he viewed any challenge, not just rebellion, but disagreement, as a personal insult. And in time, he would respond to those insults with purges, exiles, and vengeance. The real trouble began in the late 1380s, when Richard, now entering adulthood, began asserting independence from his older advisors. His court filled with favorites, men like Robert de Vere, who were deeply unpopular among the nobility. Richard's inner circle promoted centralization, increased spending, and a king-first ideology. His critics, especially the Lords Appellant, a coalition of noblemen led by the Duke of Gloucester, accused him of mismanagement and tyranny. In 1387, tensions erupted into open conflict. At the Battle of Radcot Bridge, Richard's forces were defeated. The Lords Appellant took control and purged many of the king's allies in the merciless Parliament of 1388. For a time, Richard was reduced to little more than a figurehead. But Richard never forgot, and he never forgave. By the mid-1390s, he had rebuilt his authority through patience and manipulation. One by one, his enemies were isolated, exiled, or eliminated. His cousin Henry Bolingbroke, son of John of Gaunt, was initially spared the worst of it. A capable soldier, Henry had proven himself in tournaments, military campaigns, and diplomacy. He was loyal, until he wasn't. In 1397, Richard made his move. He arrested several former appellants, including the Duke of Gloucester, who later died mysteriously in Calais. Others were tried for treason and executed. Richard, now in full control, assumed near absolute power, ruling without parliament, levying taxes unilaterally, and demanding loyalty oaths from nobles and clergy alike. He began traveling with a massive armed retinue, a roving court of intimidation, designed to suppress dissent and project royal dominance. But all of this came at a price. The kingdom became a pressure cooker, and the crown grew heavier with each unchecked impulse. Then came the final miscalculation. In 1398, Richard exiled Henry Bolingbroke for 10 years after a bitter dispute between Henry and Thomas Mowbray, Duke of Norfolk. The quarrel was over loyalty, treason, and murky accusations. But Richard saw a chance to neutralize a potential rival. When John of Gaunt died the following year, Richard extended Henry's exile to life and seized his vast Lancastrian estates for the crown. This was more than a personal slight. It was a violation of noble inheritance, a move that sent shockwaves through the aristocracy. If Richard could do this to John of Gaunt's son, he could do it to anyone. The nobility began to wonder whether the king's vision of absolute power was now unmoored from even the basic customs of feudal law. Henry didn't wait for an invitation. In 1399, while Richard was away in Ireland suppressing a rebellion, Henry landed in Yorkshire with a small force, claiming only that he had returned to reclaim his inheritance. But within weeks, his ranks swelled with disaffected nobles, barons, and even bishops. This wasn't a rebellion. It was a soft coup, executed with speed and political precision. Richard returned to find the kingdom already slipping away. He was arrested in Wales, taken to London, and, perhaps most remarkably, forced to abdicate in a carefully orchestrated ceremony. Parliament ratified the transfer of power. Henry was crowned Henry IV, the first king of the House of Lancaster. Richard was imprisoned in Pontefract Castle, and though the official record is murky, he died there in early 1400, under circumstances that remain suspicious to this day. The official story is that he starved himself, but few believed it then, and fewer believe it now. Whether he was killed or allowed to waste away, the result was the same. The divine right of kings had suffered a mortal wound. Richard's fall wasn't just the end of a reign, it was the end of an idea. He believed in kingship as sacrosanct, unchallengeable, and divinely ordained. But in reality, his position had always rested on a foundation of consent, alliances, and custom. He thought he could rule alone. Instead, he was unmade by the very nobility his ancestors had spent generations courting, fighting, and occasionally executing. Henry Bolingbroke didn't just take the crown, he created a new precedent, that the legitimacy of a king was not in his bloodline, but in his ability to rule well, or at least not to rule badly enough to unite his enemies. This was the seed of a crisis that would blossom into civil war decades later. Because if one king could be deposed by his cousin, what was to stop every future noble with a claim from doing the same? Henry IV's reign would be plagued by rebellion and plots. The memory of Richard lingered. Some still saw him as the rightful king. Some even believed he was alive, waiting to return. The damage to the monarchy wasn't just political, it was psychological. A door had been opened, and what stepped through it was a century of dynastic paranoia, conspiracy, and war. But before the Wars of the Roses could begin, before the crown became a game of musical chairs, there was another reckoning waiting in the wings. Because Henry IV didn't just steal a throne, he inherited a ghost. The ghost of a cousin he overthrew, the ghost of legitimacy broken, and the ghost of royal rule reduced to a question. If a king can be removed for failing, what happens when his son inherits that failure? Up next, Henry IV versus the Ricardian loyalists, a war not of battlefields, but of memory, a crown haunted by its own making. 10. Richard II versus Henry Bolingbroke. In the glittering dream of medieval monarchy, kings were supposed to rule by divine right, chosen by God and secured by blood. But Richard II, the poet king, the child-crowned monarch of Plantagenet descent, proved just how fragile those dreams could be. His story wasn't a rise and fall. It was a slow Baroque unraveling. A monarch obsessed with symbolism, legitimacy, and sacred authority who failed to notice that his crown was being measured by a cousin with better instincts and fewer illusions. That cousin was Henry Bolingbroke, son of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster. Steady, calculating, and unburdened by Richard's taste for ceremony, Bolingbroke wasn't born to be king, but he was built to take the throne when the conditions ripened, which they did, one reckless decision at a time. Let's rewind. Richard II became king in 1377 at the age of 10. His father, Edward the Black Prince, the most celebrated warrior of his generation, had died a year earlier, leaving behind a throne for a boy who had inherited none of his fire and all of his pride. The early years of Richard's reign were defined by regency, factionalism, and simmering discontent. England was broke, the 100 Years' War was a slow-bleeding disaster, and the tax burden fell hardest on the people least equipped to carry it. Then, in 1381, something snapped. The peasants' revolt surged up through the southeast like a sudden flood. Tens of thousands of angry subjects stormed London, fueled by overtaxation, corrupt local officials, and the grim logic that if the king was only a boy, maybe he could still be reasoned with. In a rare moment of clarity and courage, the 14-year-old Richard rode out to meet the rebels at Smithfield and promised them reform. That moment of personal bravery saved the city, but it planted a dangerous idea in the king's mind, that he alone, not the nobility or parliament, spoke for England. Richard never forgot that, and he never stopped believing it. As he matured, That belief hardened into ideology. He began to view kingship not as a practical job, but as a kind of spiritual theater. He surrounded himself with sycophants, elevated unpopular favorites like Robert de Vere, and ruled with an increasing sense of royal mysticism. He imposed new taxes. He punished critics. He ruled as if the crown had its own will, and he was merely the earthly vessel. The nobility, unsurprisingly, did not applaud this approach. In 1387, a group of aristocrats known as the Lords Appellant, including Thomas of Woodstock, Duke of Gloucester, and Richard's cousin Henry Bolingbroke, decided they'd had enough. They accused Richard's inner circle of treason, raised troops, and crushed the royal favorites at the Battle of Radcot Bridge. Richard was forced to submit. Parliament, now in control of his enemies, held the grimly named Merciless Parliament of 1388, which executed or exiled many of Richard's allies. Richard, humiliated but not broken, began to play the long game. Over the next decade, he slowly rebuilt his authority, granting pardons, regaining the trust of certain factions, and waiting for time and attrition to eliminate his enemies. He reasserted his independence in the 1390s, and one by one began exacting revenge. The Duke of Gloucester was arrested and died under mysterious circumstances in 1397. Others were exiled or executed under dubious charges. Richard claimed this purge was about restoring order. Everyone else saw it for what it was, score settling in royal robes. But the real turning point came in 1399, and it began, ironically, with a family squabble. That year, Richard exiled his cousin Henry Bolingbroke after a dispute with another noble, Thomas Mowbray. The official reason was that their quarrel threatened the stability of the realm. The real reason was likely more sinister. Richard distrusted Bolingbroke's growing popularity and wanted him out of the picture. Then, just months later, John of Gaunt, Henry's father and Richard's uncle, died. As Gaunt's heir, Henry should have inherited the vast Lancastrian estates. Instead, Richard did something breathtakingly short-sighted. He confiscated the lands for the crown and extended Henry's exile indefinitely. This was not just a personal betrayal. It was a violation of the feudal contract. Inheritance, for the nobility, was sacred. It was the glue that held the entire social structure together. If the king could strip a duke's son of his rightful patrimony, what protection did lesser nobles have? For the first time, the nobility stopped asking if Richard was reckless and began asking if he was dangerous. And Henry? He didn't sit quietly in exile. While Richard was off in Ireland trying to crush a rebellion, Bolingbroke returned to England in June 1399. He claimed he was only coming back to reclaim his lands, not to make a play for the throne. But his actions said otherwise. He marched with increasing support, rallied disaffected nobles, and within weeks had seized control of large parts of the country. Richard, caught off guard and increasingly isolated, returned to England and was immediately outmaneuvered. By August, he was captured and imprisoned. What followed was one of the most calculated and carefully choreographed coups in English history. Richard was forced to abdicate. Parliament confirmed the deposition, and Henry Bolingbroke was crowned Henry IV. To justify the act, Henry made a speech that still echoes through English political thought. He didn't claim conquest. He didn't lean on divine right. He claimed the throne by virtue of his bloodline and the will of the people. It was a legal sleight of hand that transformed treason into legitimacy, a revolution wrapped in the language of restoration. But the deposition of Richard II created a problem that would haunt the English monarchy for generations. Richard had been anointed. That mattered. In medieval theology, kings weren't just rulers. They were consecrated figures. To depose a king was to tamper with the divine order. Even if he had failed politically, Richard remained sacred in principle. His removal didn't just replace one monarch with another. It shattered the idea that kingship was above politics. And then, of course, there was the issue of what to do with him. Richard was held at Pontefract Castle, and in early 1400, he died. The official story was self-starvation. The unofficial version, whispered across Europe, was murder. No formal trial, no public confession. Just a dead king in a cold castle, and a new king trying to convince the realm that it was all very clean and necessary. But it wasn't. Richard's death cast a long shadow. Some said he was still alive, hiding in Scotland. Others said he would return with French backing. These rumors weren't idle gossip. They became political weapons, used by rebels and rivals to challenge Henry IV's shaky claim. The specter of Richard gave rise to Ricardian plots, like the Epiphany Rising of 1400 and the Percy Rebellion of 1403. Each one invoked Richard's memory, either as a martyred king or as a cautionary tale. In the end, the feud between Richard II and Henry Bolingbroke wasn't just a personal rivalry. It was a pivot point in English history. It marked the end of Plantagenet stability and the beginning of a century-long spiral into dynastic paranoia, noble opportunism, and the blood-drenched chaos of the Wars of the Roses. Because once the line had been crossed, once it became acceptable to remove a king for failing, every throne after was just a seat someone else was waiting to claim. And Henry IV? He may have seized the crown, but he inherited more than a kingdom. He inherited a curse. Because even as he tried to rule, he found himself fighting off the ghosts of the past, and the seeds of rebellion that would come not from strangers, but from his own court, and even his own lineage. Next comes the fallout. Henry IV versus the Ricardian loyalist cause, where rumors, ghosts, and wounded legacies refuse to stay buried. 11. Henry IV versus the Ricardian loyalist cause. Henry IV had a crown, but not quite a throne. He sat upon it, yes, resplendent in robes praised in ceremony, sealed by Parliament, blessed by clergy, but the floor beneath him was cracked. He had taken the crown from Richard II, not through war or conquest, but through a quieter, far more dangerous mechanism, legitimized usurpation. The paperwork was clean. The rituals were performed. The oaths were sworn. But nobody forgot what it actually was. It was a coup, sanctified only by the speed of its execution and the political exhaustion of those who let it happen. And so, Henry IV spent the entirety of his reign under siege, not from armies, but from memory. The feuds that followed his coronation were less about rebellion than about identity. What kind of king was he? The right king? The safe king? The necessary king? The answer changed depending on the angle. To his supporters, Henry was a stabilizer, a corrective, a man forced by Richard's failures to step in and restore order. But to his enemies, both open and quiet, Henry was the architect of national blasphemy, a man who had broken the sacred link between monarchy and God. Because no matter how badly Richard II had ruled, no matter how many enemies he had accumulated, he had still been anointed. To depose an anointed king was to suggest that God could be overruled by Parliament. That failure was stronger than divine right. That legitimacy could be corrected with enough signatures and a good speech. Henry didn't just inherit a kingdom, he inherited a precedent. And that precedent meant that every noble in England who thought they had a better claim, or just more charisma, could now imagine wearing the crown themselves. But before any of those dreams could grow teeth, Henry had a more immediate problem. The ghost of Richard II refused to go quietly. The very first challenge came in January 1400, less than 3 months after Henry's coronation. Group of nobles: Thomas Holland, Earl of Kent, John Montague, Earl of Salisbury, and others, planned a bold move to assassinate Henry and his sons at Windsor during a New Year's tournament and restore Richard II to the throne. It was a plot built on 2 key assumptions. First, that Richard was still alive, and second, that enough of the realm would support his restoration once Henry was dead. The first part was true. Richard was alive, imprisoned at Pontefract Castle. The second was wildly optimistic. The Epiphany Rising, as it came to be called, collapsed before it began. The conspirators were betrayed by one of their own. Henry escaped Windsor, raised loyal troops, and crushed the rebellion. Most of the rebels were executed swiftly, some without formal trials. Their deaths were brutal, their lands seized, their families disgraced. And Richard? He died shortly after, his cause fatally wounded by the failed coup that bore his name. Officially, he starved to death. Unofficially, the timing was suspicious. Richard died in February 1400, just a month after the Epiphany Rising. Whether he was murdered, forced into suicide, or simply allowed to waste away remains one of the great unresolved questions of English royal history. Either way, he was gone, but not forgotten. In fact, Richard II became more dangerous dead than he had ever been alive. Rumors spread like a fever that Richard had escaped, that a look-alike had died in his place, that he was gathering forces in Scotland or France, that he would return, lead a rebellion, and expose Henry as the usurper he had always been. Henry did what he could to fight back. In 1400, he had Richard's body exhumed and reburied at Westminster Abbey with full royal honors. A symbolic act meant to silence conspiracy theories and frame the transition as lawful and complete. It didn't work. Throughout the first half of Henry's reign, Ricardian loyalism remained a live wire, an invisible thread tying together disparate rebellions, plots, and crises that all shared one underlying belief: that Henry IV was not the true king and never had been. But the threat didn't only come from rumors. It came from names, real names, with real claims. Most dangerously, Edmund Mortimer, 5th Earl of March. Mortimer was a direct descendant of Lionel of Antwerp, the second surviving son of Edward III. Henry IV, by contrast, descended from John of Gaunt, Edward III's third son. In strict terms of primogeniture, the Mortimer line held the superior claim, and Richard II had even named young Edmund as his heir before being deposed. To make matters worse, Edmund was a child when Henry took the throne, making him both harmless and politically radioactive. Henry kept him at court, under tight watch, educated alongside the royal princes, and guarded more closely than the Tower of London. But it was a containment strategy, not a solution, because Edmund had uncles. In 1402, Edmund's uncle, Sir Edmund Mortimer, was captured by the Welsh rebel leader Owain Glyndwr during the Battle of Bryn Glas. Henry refused to pay his ransom, either out of frugality or fear that Mortimer would be turned. It was a mistake. Mortimer switched sides, married Glyndwr's daughter, and openly declared that his nephew, young Edmund, was the rightful king of England. This turned a simmering dynastic grudge into an open threat. The Glyndwr revolt, already a serious crisis in Wales, now had a national dimension. It became a movement not just of regional resistance, but of restoration. And then, like a spark to dry timber, the Percys joined the fire. The Percy family, led by Henry Hotspur Percy, his father Northumberland, and Uncle Worcester, had been among Henry IV's strongest allies during his rise to power. But by 1403, they felt underappreciated, underpaid, and politically snubbed. They were exhausted from defending the northern borders and furious over Henry's refusal to ransom Mortimer. The result was an unlikely alliance. Glyndwr, Mortimer, and the Percys formed a triple rebellion, united by shared grievances and one goal: the removal of Henry IV. At Shrewsbury, in July 1403, Hotspur led an army against the king. The battle was brutal and close. Henry's forces barely won. Hotspur was killed, Mortimer remained in Wales, and Glyndwr held out for nearly a decade afterward. But the underlying cause, the belief that Henry had no right to rule, survived the battlefield. And it wasn't just nobles. Even ordinary people, local clergy, and minor officials clung to Ricardian loyalty. Throughout the 1400s, there were reports of Richard II sightings in the north, of secret masses being said for his soul, of tavern songs celebrating his promised return. Pretenders emerged, sometimes backed by foreign courts, each claiming to be the lost king. In this climate, Henry IV ruled not as a sovereign, but as a suspect. He was constantly raising money for defense, creating harsh laws against prophecies and sedition, and suppressing potential threats from within his own court. Even his health seemed to deteriorate under the weight of paranoia and stress. He suffered from a mysterious illness, possibly a skin condition or chronic disorder, that left him weak, dependent, and painfully aware of his vulnerability. By the time of his death in 1413, Henry IV had survived more than a dozen plots and uprisings. But he had never silenced the doubt. His entire reign was one long argument against the idea that he didn't belong. It's tempting to judge Henry by his reactionary measures, the executions, the tax hikes, the autocratic tendencies, but he was a man trying to hold together a kingdom that had never fully accepted him. He didn't inherit rebellion. He earned it, by setting the precedent that a king could be replaced, then spending the rest of his life convincing the realm not to try it again. Modern historians tend to read his reign as the beginning of a new era, not just in politics, but in the psychology of kingship. After Henry IV, no monarch could afford to rule purely on divine right. They had to govern, to win support, to justify their authority, to perform stability even when it didn't exist. In other words, they had to fear their own subjects. And Henry's legacy? It was paradoxical. He built the Lancastrian dynasty, but also sowed the seeds of its destruction. He held the throne, but never quite the country's confidence. He subdued rebellion, but never its cause, because Richard II may have been gone. But the idea of him, the king who couldn't be replaced without consequences, was just getting started. And the next great feud would erupt not between houses, but within one, between a king whose claim was lawful but weak, and a nobleman whose bloodline whispered louder than loyalty. Henry VI versus Richard, Duke of York, and the beginning of the storm we now call the Wars of the Roses. 12. Henry VI versus Richard, Duke of York. When a king is born too gentle for his age, history tends not to be kind. And when his greatest rival shares his blood, his title, and his ambition, the throne begins to shake. So it was with Henry VI, a monarch so pious and pliable, he seemed more suited to a monastery than a battlefield. And so it was with Richard, Duke of York, the man who would set England ablaze in his pursuit of a crown he believed should never have passed him by. The result? One of the most infamous royal feuds in English history. A dynastic meltdown so devastating it spawned a multi-decade civil war that would be remembered simply as the Wars of the Roses. To understand how things got this twisted, we have to start with a birth. Or, rather, two. Henry VI came into the world in 1421, the only son of the warrior king Henry V. His father died when Henry was still an infant, leaving him a crown he could barely hold, let alone understand. By age 1, he was King of England and France, on paper, but in reality, a rotating caste of nobles governed in his name. By the time Henry came of age, the victories of his father had evaporated, and England's continental empire was crumbling. At home, factions grew, ambitions sharpened, and at the center of it all sat a king unwilling to command, unable to confront. Enter Richard, Duke of York. Born in 1411, Richard had royal blood coursing through both veins. He was a descendant of Edward III not once but twice, his mother a Mortimer, his father a York. His claim to the throne was, in many ways, stronger than Henry VI, especially if one believed that legitimacy came from capability rather than direct inheritance. Richard had spent years serving in France, governing unruly territories, commanding troops, and building a reputation as both a soldier and a reformer. But back in England, He was systematically passed over for high office in favor of the king's favorites, particularly Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, a man with his own vague claims to royal favor and a gift for losing battles expensively. As Henry's reign floundered, so did the country. Economic instability, rampant corruption, a breakdown in law and order. By the 1450s, England was less a kingdom than a powder keg. Then, in 1453, Henry VI suffered a complete mental collapse, catatonic, unresponsive, unable to speak. For over a year, the country had no functioning monarch. And that's when Richard made his move. He was appointed protector of the realm, a kind of constitutional babysitter. And for a time, things seemed to improve. But when Henry recovered in late 1454, Richard was dismissed, and Somerset reinstated. To Richard, it wasn't just a snub. It was a declaration of war. The first open clash came in 1455 at St. Albans. Richard and his allies marched on the king, ostensibly to remove evil advisors. Read, Somerset. The battle was short, brutal, and shocking. Somerset was killed. The king was wounded. And suddenly, the crown had been bloodied by its own. Over the next 5 years, England seesawed between uneasy truces and violent outbursts. Richard was in, then out, then in again. He danced a careful line between claiming he wanted to reform the realm and openly gunning for the throne. Meanwhile, Queen Margaret of Anjou, Henry's formidable wife, emerged as a political force, rallying loyalists and organizing military resistance. In 1460, Richard made his boldest play yet. He entered Parliament and formally claimed the crown, presenting his genealogy and demanding recognition. The Lords recoiled. Even Richard's allies weren't ready to depose a consecrated king. A compromise was brokered. Henry would remain king for life, but Richard and his heirs would succeed him, cutting off Henry's own son, Edward of Westminster. This was political poison. Margaret refused to accept her son's disinheritance. She raised an army in the north and struck hard. In December 1460, Richard marched out to confront her. He never came back. At the Battle of Wakefield, Richard was ambushed, outnumbered, and killed. Legend says his enemies displayed his severed head on the gates of York, crowned mockingly with paper. But this was not the end, because Richard had raised sons, and his eldest, Edward, would take up the feud and turn it into a full-blown war. Within months, Edward would win the decisive Battle of Towton, claim the throne as Edward IV, and force Henry VI into exile. The irony? Henry VI, the king who never wanted war, ended up presiding over one of the bloodiest civil conflicts in England's history. And Richard, the reformer-turned-rival, became a martyr whose death lit the fuse for a new dynasty. This feud wasn't just a struggle over a crown. It was a referendum on what kind of king England wanted. A pious, passive figurehead? Or a ruthless, pragmatic warrior? In the end, the country chose the latter. But peace was nowhere in sight. Because even as Richard fell and Edward rose, the ghost of Henry VI still lingered. Margaret of Anjou wasn't finished, and dynastic legitimacy, once cracked, doesn't heal. It fractures. Next, Edward IV versus Henry VI, the Lancastrian court, when rival kings fight for the same throne, and loyalty becomes a currency no one can afford to keep. 13. Edward IV versus Henry VI, the Lancastrian court. In a country where royal titles came with a body count, England in the 1460s found itself in a bizarre condition. 2 kings, 1 throne, and no peace. On one side was Henry VI, deposed but not quite gone. On the other stood Edward IV, young, bold, and determined to erase any memory of the feeble man he had replaced. What followed wasn't just a continuation of the Wars of the Roses, it was the deadly sequel. Think fewer speeches, more blood, and a deeper descent into dynastic chaos. Edward IV didn't just inherit the crown, he took it. In 1461, following the death of his father, Richard of York, Edward led the Yorkist cause to a crushing victory at the Battle of Towton. It was one of the bloodiest battles ever fought on English soil, and it ended with Henry VI and his queen, Margaret of Anjou, fleeing into exile. But while Edward was crowned in Westminster, Henry never officially abdicated. This meant the realm had what no stable kingdom should ever have: two monarchs in active circulation, each with a shadow court, loyal followers, and a claim blessed by God and blood. Edward IV, barely 19, wasted no time in asserting his authority. He consolidated power, rewarded allies, and tried to build the image of a new royal order. But the Lancastrians were far from finished. Margaret raised forces in the north. There were raids, rebellions, and whispers of foreign support. Henry, wandering through the countryside like a royal ghost, became a symbol of divine suffering for his loyalists, and a walking liability for Edward. Meanwhile, the political chessboard began to shift. At first, Edward was propped up by the powerful Earl of Warwick, Richard Neville, a man so instrumental in Edward's rise that he earned the nickname the Kingmaker. But as the years wore on, Warwick grew disillusioned. He had expected to control the king. Instead, he found Edward irritatingly independent, particularly in matters of marriage and foreign policy. Edward's secret wedding to Elizabeth Woodville, a commoner and a widow from a Lancastrian family, was the final insult. The Woodvilles rose quickly in court, accumulating titles and enemies in equal measure. Warwick, sidelined and enraged, began exploring a shocking possibility: switching sides. By 1470, the unthinkable happened. Warwick allied with his old enemy, Margaret of Anjou, and engineered Edward's temporary exile. In a stunning reversal, Henry VI was restored to the throne in what was called the readeption. The old king returned to London, dazed and diminished, more figurehead than ruler. His brief second reign was less a comeback than a political prop job, staged by people who needed a body in the crown, not a brain behind it. Edward, regrouping in Burgundy, wasted no time. He returned in 1471 with military backing, sweeping through England with speed and efficiency. In April 1471, he defeated and killed Warwick at the Battle of Barnet. 2 weeks later, he crushed Margaret's army at the Battle of Tewkesbury. Her son, Edward of Westminster, the only Lancastrian heir, was killed in the fighting. Margaret was captured, and Henry VI, that gentle, broken relic of a king, was taken back to the Tower of London. On the night of May 21st, 1471, Henry VI died in custody. Officially, he died of melancholy. Unofficially, everyone knew Edward had eliminated the last threat to his reign. No more rival courts, no more divided crowns, just Edward IV, now unchallenged. This feud had finally ended, but it had rewritten the rules of monarchy in the process. It wasn't enough to be born to the throne anymore. You had to defend it, with armies, with propaganda, with ruthlessness. The divine right of kings was now conditional on strength, survival, and complete control of the narrative. Edward IV reigned in peace for 12 more years. But peace in this family never lasted long, because while he may have buried his Lancastrian rivals, he left behind a pair of sons too young to rule and too vulnerable to protect themselves. And waiting in the wings was his own brother, a man with ambition, opportunity, and a very different vision of royal order. Next, Richard III versus Edward V and the Woodville faction, when protectors become predators, and the fate of two young princes vanishes into the Tower. 14. Richard III versus Edward V and the Woodville faction. In the spring of 1483, England had a king, but no crown. Edward V, just 12 years old, had inherited the throne from his father, Edward IV, but he hadn't yet been crowned. And in the dangerous vacuum between succession and coronation, the very idea of kingship became a contested battleground. At the center of the storm stood his uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, a man entrusted to protect the boy king, and the one who would ultimately take everything from him. This wasn't just a feud between brothers or even cousins. It was a power struggle dressed up as guardianship, a high-stakes chess match in which every piece was a noble family, every move backed by swords, and the checkmate came with a crown. And the prize wasn't just a throne, it was the future of the entire Yorkist dynasty. To understand what went wrong, you have to understand what Edward IV left behind. An unstable alliance of ambition and resentment. His Queen Elizabeth Woodville had elevated her large, ambitious family into positions of wealth and influence. The Woodvilles were resented by much of the old nobility, who saw them as upstart opportunists. And Richard, though loyal to his brother in life, had little love for the Queen's kin. When Edward IV died suddenly in April 1483, the kingdom was already ripe for rupture. Edward V was in Ludlow under the care of his maternal uncle, Anthony Woodville, Earl Rivers. The young king was being groomed for leadership, educated in chivalry, law, and royal responsibility. But news of Edward IV's death triggered a scramble for control. Queen Elizabeth wanted her son crowned immediately, with her family managing the regency. Richard, named Lord Protector in Edward IV's will, insisted the boy be brought to London under his guardianship. The two visions could not coexist. Richard moved first. As Edward V traveled to London, Richard intercepted him at Stony Stratford, arrested Rivers and other Woodville associates, and escorted the boy king to the capital under armed guard. At first, there was calm. Edward V was housed in the Tower of London, a traditional location for pre-coronation residency, but the coronation was repeatedly delayed. Rumors swirled. The Woodvilles were sidelined. Elizabeth Woodville, sensing danger, sought sanctuary at Westminster Abbey with her remaining children. Then came the masterstroke. Richard's ally, Dr. Ralph Shaw, delivered a sermon at St. Paul's Cross claiming that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid due to a prior betrothal. This made all their children, including Edward V, illegitimate. Parliament quickly passed the Titulus Regius, affirming this claim and officially naming Richard as the rightful king. On July 6, 1483, Richard was crowned Richard III. Edward V, along with his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, remained in the Tower. And then, sometime later that summer, they disappeared. No official announcement. No funeral, no trial, no confession, just absence. The disappearance of the princes in the Tower became one of the most chilling mysteries in English history. The most accepted version? That Richard III ordered their deaths to eliminate rivals and secure his throne, but Richard never admitted to it. And no bodies were conclusively identified until centuries later. And even then, the identification remained unconfirmed. Still, the damage was done. Richard's image darkened, his legitimacy eroded, and former Yorkist allies began to turn. Key among them, Lady Margaret Beaufort, mother of Henry Tudor, the exiled Lancastrian with a tenuous claim and a growing army. Richard tried to rule, and in many respects he ruled well. He passed laws protecting landowners from corrupt officials, reformed aspects of the court system, and maintained strong regional governance. But the shadow of the Tower never left him. It stalked his reputation, both at home and abroad. To many, he was not a king. He was a child-snatching usurper. In 1485, just 2 years after taking the crown, Richard III faced rebellion. At the Battle of Bosworth Field, Henry Tudor's forces defeated him. Richard died in combat, the last English king to fall on the battlefield. Henry Tudor was crowned Henry VII, and almost immediately married Elizabeth of York, Edward IV's daughter, symbolically uniting the warring houses of Lancaster and York. He also repealed the Titulus Regius, erasing Richard's legal claim and restoring legitimacy to the dead princes. This feud had ended not just a dynasty, but an entire era. With it, the Plantagenet claim collapsed and the Tudor age began. But the mystery of the princes never faded. For centuries, historians, playwrights, and novelists have obsessed over their fate. Richard III's defenders argue he was innocent, a victim of Tudor propaganda. His critics point to motive, opportunity, and the cold logic of dynastic warfare. Whatever the truth, the feud between Richard III and Edward V left more than bodies behind. It left a haunting question. Can a protector ever truly be trusted when the thing they're protecting is the very thing they want to possess? Next, Henry VII versus Yorkist pretenders, where the ghosts of a shattered dynasty return in the form of impostors, and the new king learns that winning the crown was just the beginning. 15. Henry VII versus the Yorkist pretenders. By the time Henry VII took the English throne in 1485, the battlefield was strewn with ghosts. The Wars of the Roses were supposedly over. The House of Lancaster, his house in theory, had won. But this was a hollow peace, held together by fear, marriage contracts, and a crown snatched from the dirt at Bosworth Field. There were no grand parades, no decisive settling of the score. Just one man, Henry Tudor, with a paper-thin claim to the throne and a realm trained by civil war to sniff out weakness. And they could smell it on him. Henry's royal lineage was fragile at best. He was descended from John of Gaunt's illegitimate line, later legitimized by statute but explicitly barred from the throne. His right to rule came not from inheritance, but from conquest, which worked so long as he could hold it. But conquest, like prophecy, invites challengers. And Henry's reign would be shaped not by his own policies or wars, but by a series of shadows. Men who may or may not have been who they claimed to be, but whose very existence threatened to rip the crown from his head. This was not a reign. It was a series of auditions for disaster. The first real challenge came in 1487, barely 2 years into Henry's kingship. The name on everyone's lips was Lambert Simnel, a boy of around 10 who appeared in Ireland claiming to be Edward, Earl of Warwick, the son of George, Duke of Clarence, and a legitimate Yorkist heir. There was just one problem. The real Edward of Warwick was alive and imprisoned in the Tower of London. But this didn't stop the rebellion. Truth was optional. Optics were everything. The plan had been masterminded by John de la Pole, Earl of Lincoln, a Yorkist with real blood in the game. Lincoln had once been named heir presumptive by Richard III, and now that the king was dead and the Tudors were in charge, he needed a new frontman. He chose Simnel. Not because he believed in him, but because Simnel was plausible enough to rally the old Yorkist networks, nobles, foreign allies, and the Irish, who had long supported the House of York and were eager to cause trouble for the new king. Simnel was crowned King Edward VI in Dublin with a makeshift ceremony that included a wooden crown. To the Yorkists, the pageantry wasn't a joke. It was a signal. An army of German and Irish mercenaries was raised, financed in part by Margaret of Burgundy, Richard III's sister, and a perpetual thorn in Henry's side. This was not a fringe movement. It was a full-fledged insurrection. Henry, to his credit, handled it with brutal efficiency. He paraded the real Earl of Warwick through London to expose the fraud. He marshaled a professional army and intercepted the rebels at Stokefield in June 1487. The resulting battle was short and bloody. The Yorkists were crushed. Lincoln was killed. The rebellion was over. Simnel, astonishingly, was spared. Henry recognized he was a puppet, not a threat. The boy was given a job in the royal kitchens, a soft prison sentence in an apron. It was a clever move, mercy framed as magnanimity, and humiliation dressed as clemency. But Henry understood the real danger wasn't in child actors, it was in the scriptwriters hiding behind them. And they weren't done. Enter Perkin Warbeck. This was the real nightmare. Warbeck emerged in the early 1490s in the court of Burgundy, claiming to be Richard, Duke of York, one of the vanished princes in the Tower. If Simnel had been a local production, Warbeck was a European feature film, with foreign backers, grand staging, and a claim that struck at the core of the Tudor narrative. Because what if Warbeck was telling the truth? He looked the part. He spoke French and Latin. He behaved like a prince. And crucially, he had support. Not just from Yorkist exiles, but from foreign monarchs. Margaret of Burgundy recognized him as her nephew. Maximilian I, Holy Roman Emperor, backed his claim. Even James IV of Scotland took him seriously, offering him marriage to a Scottish noblewoman and troops for an invasion. Henry responded with a mixture of intelligence operations, bribery, and political suppression. He tightened surveillance, imposed bonds on the nobility, essentially forced loans as insurance against rebellion, and reshuffled his court to weed out disloyalty. He knew that Warbeck's power wasn't his army. It was the story. The idea that he might be one of the lost princes returning to claim what had been stolen. For nearly a decade, Warbeck launched intermittent threats. A failed landing in Kent in 1495. A temporary court in Ireland. A brief, theatrical invasion from Scotland. Each time, he was repelled or fled. Yet each attempt kept the myth alive. Each false start raised questions Henry couldn't permanently silence. By 1497, Warbeck landed in Cornwall and declared himself king once again. But the Cornish had their own grievances, taxation mainly, and weren't particularly committed to his royal identity. His rebellion fizzled. He was captured, imprisoned, and, after an attempted escape, executed in 1499. That same year, the real Edward of Warwick was also executed. Officially, he'd been plotting with Warbeck. In reality, Henry knew the time for leniency was over. Too many ghosts were walking the halls. Too many people believed in kings who shouldn't exist. With their deaths, the major Yorkist threats were silenced. But the psychological scars remained. Henry VII ruled for 24 more years. He consolidated power, reformed finance, and laid the groundwork for the centralized Tudor state. But at its heart, his reign was not about governance, it was about survival. The Tudor dynasty was founded not on divine right or unbroken lineage, but on a battlefield claim, a marriage to a Yorkist princess, Elizabeth of York, and an unrelenting campaign to control the story. That campaign never really ended. Henry's obsession with legitimacy bled into his son's reign. Henry VIII would inherit not just a crown, but the paranoia that came with it. He too would destroy claimants, rewrite succession laws, and even break from Rome to ensure his line held power. And yet, the irony of Henry VII's struggle is that the pretenders he feared most, the boys claiming to be someone else, were often symptoms, not causes, of instability. What they revealed was a nation still deeply divided, traumatized by decades of dynastic war, and all too willing to gamble on any alternative that felt familiar, Yorkist, or simply not Tudor. Warbeck and Simnel weren't just frauds. They were proxies, symbols of a fractured realm still unsure whether it had chosen the right king or whether kings could even be chosen anymore at all. Because if a boy with a crown of wood could raise an army, if a stranger with the right accent could become a prince, then what did monarchy mean? What did legitimacy mean? For Henry VII, the answer was control. Control of the narrative, control of the claim, and when necessary, control of the bloodline itself. But the ghosts never really left. Not from the towers, not from the churches, not from the hearts of those who still believed a different king might return. Because the next Tudor feud would begin not with impostors, but with a queen. And not just any queen, but one whose marriage would tear apart the world's oldest religious order, split Christendom, and launch a reformation dressed as a divorce. Next, Henry VIII versus Catherine of Aragon, where love, power, and succession collide, and the king declares himself above not just Parliament, but the Pope. 16. Henry VIII versus Catherine of Aragon. Every royal feud has a body count. Some pile the dead on battlefields, others in towers. But the war between Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon left its victims in souls, in churches, and in the very structure of English life itself. It was a feud disguised as a marital dispute, then as a dynastic crisis, and finally, catastrophically, as a theological reckoning. At the heart of it stood a king who wanted to be remembered as a god on earth, and a queen who believed she already answered to one. When Henry VIII married Catherine in 1509, it was a dynastic chess move dressed in a love story. She had been married to Henry's older brother Arthur, who died shortly after their wedding in 1502. For 7 years, Catherine lingered in England, a Spanish princess with no throne, no dowry, and an awkward liminal status that displeased everyone but was too politically inconvenient to resolve. The logical next step, once Henry became king, was to marry her and keep the Anglo-Spanish alliance intact. And for a while it worked. Catherine was pious, regal, and early on, fertile. She bore Henry several children, but only one survived infancy. Mary, born in 1516. By Tudor standards, this was a respectable, if not ideal, outcome. But for Henry, who believed a woman could not credibly rule alone, it was a long-term problem wrapped in temporary celebration. Then came the turning point. Anne Boleyn. Anne wasn't the root cause of the feud, but she became the accelerant. Henry's infatuation with her coincided with a broader fear. What happens to a dynasty with no male heir? The Wars of the Roses were still a living memory. Henry VII, Henry's own father, had taken the crown not by birthright, but by conquest. A weak succession wasn't just risky, it was an invitation for civil war. Henry began to rethink his marriage to Catherine, not as a love mismatch, but as a spiritual misstep. He scoured canon law and discovered, or perhaps invented, a theological loophole, Leviticus 20:21, which states that if a man marries his brother's wife, it is an unclean act, and they will be childless. Catherine insisted her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated. Henry insisted this didn't matter. He now believed, or at least claimed, that God was punishing him with a lack of sons because of this union. Convenient theology for a man who had already set his sights on another woman. So he launched what became known as the King's Great Matter, his campaign to annul his marriage to Catherine. Here's the catch. England was Catholic, and divorces, especially for kings, weren't a matter of local legislation. They were subject to papal approval. And the Pope, unfortunately for Henry, was in no position to be generous. Why? Because Catherine's nephew was Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, who at the time had militarily sacked Rome and taken the Pope hostage. Yes, literally. The Pope, Clement VII, was Charles V's political prisoner, and was not going to risk offending the emperor by annulling his aunt's marriage. The political optics were bad. The theological implications were worse. And Henry VIII? He was furious. For 6 years, from 1527 to 1533, Henry maneuvered through every possible channel to have his marriage annulled. He petitioned the Pope. He appealed to scholars. He even convened his own church courts. But Catherine would not yield. She insisted she was the rightful queen, that her marriage to Arthur was never consummated, and that Mary was the legitimate heir to the throne. Catherine's refusal to go quietly turned this from a legal wrangle into a constitutional standoff. She had powerful allies, not just in Europe, but within England itself. The public sympathized with her. She was seen as virtuous, wronged, and fiercely principled. Henry, meanwhile, grew increasingly obsessed, increasingly isolated, and increasingly dangerous. He began purging his court of dissenters. He grew more erratic, and his desire for Anne, now an obsession with male heirs, transformed from courtly love to imperial ambition. Then came the most decisive and dangerous move of all. Henry broke from Rome. In 1533, after secretly marrying Anne Boleyn, he pushed Parliament to pass the Act in Restraint of Appeals, declaring that no English subject could appeal to the Pope on any matter, including matrimonial law. A year later came the Act of Supremacy, formally naming the king as supreme head of the Church of England. This was not just a divorce. It was a revolution in church-state relations. A monarchy that had always bowed, at least publicly, to the authority of Rome now stood alone. A new ecclesiastical order was born, one where royal will replaced papal decree, and where theology bent to dynastic necessity. Catherine, now stripped of her title, banished from court, and forbidden from seeing her daughter, never recanted. She lived in isolation, clinging to the belief that she remained the rightful Queen of England. Her letters to Henry were signed, heartbreakingly, Catherine the Queen. Her health deteriorated, and she died in 1536. Henry, meanwhile, didn't get what he wanted. Anne Boleyn gave birth not to a son, but to a daughter, Elizabeth, born in 1533. Within 3 years, Anne too had fallen from favor, arrested and executed on charges that even Henry's most loyal allies whispered were absurd. Another queen removed, another heir disputed. And the male heir Henry had obsessed over? He came finally with Jane Seymour, Henry's third wife, Edward VI, a fragile, sickly boy whose short life would ignite yet another round of religious turmoil, and who would die without issue. Looking back, it's easy to treat Henry VIII's break with Catherine as the personal tantrum of a lustful monarch. But that misses the deeper mechanics at work. This feud wasn't about love, it was about power, succession, and the theology of kingship. Henry didn't just want to rid himself of Catherine. He wanted to rewire the laws of inheritance, to redefine truth itself. Catherine, in resisting, revealed just how potent a single figure of conscience could be. She didn't raise armies. She didn't forge alliances. She simply refused to surrender her identity, and in doing so, she became a symbol, not just of Catholic loyalty, but of personal principle against autocratic power. Her daughter, Mary, would inherit both her mother's faith and her unyielding temperament. And the realm would inherit a fractured church, a monarchy now spiritually sovereign, and a population pulled between loyalty to the old order and fear of the new. Henry's feud with Catherine didn't just end one marriage. It rewrote the genetic code of English governance. It ended the long marriage between England and the papacy. It transformed Parliament into a tool for personal rule. And it birthed a religious identity crisis that would last, in some ways, for centuries. And yet, the seeds of Henry's eventual nightmare had already been planted. Because in casting aside Catherine and delegitimizing Mary, he didn't solve the succession crisis. He split it. The Tudors now had multiple potential heirs. One Catholic, Mary, one Protestant, Elizabeth, and one male, fragile and tragically doomed, Edward. And the moment Henry was gone, all three would compete, not with armies but with doctrine, legislation, and state terror. The king who broke the Pope's power left behind a house divided by the gospel. Next, Henry VIII versus Princess Mary, when a daughter becomes a threat and faith becomes the fault line of a family unraveling. 17. Henry VIII versus Princess Mary. The feud between Henry VIII and Princess Mary wasn't a war over territory or power in the usual sense. It was a war over identity, a slow-burning, deeply personal Cold War between a king and the daughter he no longer recognized. By the end of it, Mary Tudor would be broken, reassembled, and turned into something unrecognizable to herself. The same girl who had once been the cherished only surviving child of Henry and Catherine of Aragon became a political inconvenience, a dynastic afterthought, and, most fatally in Tudor England, a walking challenge to her father's divinity. Mary wasn't just his daughter. She was the last reminder of a past he was trying to erase. Let's go back. When Mary was born in 1516, she was a triumph. After multiple failed pregnancies and dead children, Catherine of Aragon finally delivered a healthy heir. Sure, she was a girl, but Henry doted on her anyway. She was intelligent, musically gifted, politically sharp. Ambassadors wrote home about her poise. She was raised like a queen in waiting, fluent in Latin, French, Spanish, theology. Even Erasmus praised her intellect. For years, Mary was the undisputed heir, and Henry invested in her as such. But by the time she was a teenager, her entire identity, her lineage, her birthright, even her name, was under siege. It started slowly. Henry began to question his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, citing the Levitical prohibition against marrying a brother's widow. But beneath the legalese and theological footnotes, the issue was brutally simple. Catherine had not produced a male heir, and Henry had fallen in love, or perhaps into obsession, with Anne Boleyn. Mary watched it all unfold in real time. Her mother's status shifted from Queen to Dowager Princess of Wales. Her own legitimacy was suddenly in review. And while Henry maneuvered to marry Anne and sever ties with the Pope, Mary's status was being stripped, methodically, symbolically, and legally. By 1533, Henry had married Anne Boleyn. Catherine was banished, and Mary was officially declared illegitimate. The girl who had once been heir to the throne now found herself rebranded as a bastard, removed from court, forbidden from seeing her mother, and forced to serve as a lady-in-waiting to her baby half-sister Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter. It was a calculated humiliation. Mary refused to comply. She still referred to herself as Princess Mary. She insisted her mother was the rightful queen. She refused to sign any document acknowledging the annulment of her parents' marriage or the legitimacy of Anne and Elizabeth. In Tudor England, that wasn't just a family squabble. It was treason adjacent. By rejecting Henry's new marriage, Mary was rejecting the legal foundation of his supremacy as head of the Church of England. She wasn't just defying her father, she was denying the divine right of the crown. But Henry didn't send guards, not yet. Instead, he sent silence. Mary was moved to increasingly remote residences, cut off from allies and advisors, denied access to physicians and letters. She was ill often, physically and emotionally. And when her mother, Catherine of Aragon, died in 1536, Mary was not allowed to attend the funeral. She would never see her mother again. The grief was immense. But the psychological warfare was just beginning. That same year, Anne Boleyn was arrested and executed. The cause? Charges of adultery, incest, treason, all debated, all likely false. Anne's fall should have lifted the pressure off Mary. Instead, it reframed the conflict. With Anne gone, there was no longer a queen to legitimize. But Henry's need for obedience hadn't vanished. It had intensified, because now his authority stood alone. Enter Thomas Cromwell. Henry's chief minister was a master of administrative cruelty. He understood that controlling Mary wasn't just about obedience. It was about symbolism. The Reformation had to be more than a schism with Rome. It had to reprogram the monarchy's bloodline. That meant Mary had to submit, not just politically, but theologically. In 1536, Parliament passed the Second Act of Succession, which declared both Mary and Elizabeth illegitimate. Henry's only legitimate children would come from his third wife, Jane Seymour. Mary was given one option: sign a formal acknowledgement of her illegitimacy and her father's authority as supreme head of the church, or remain cut off permanently. Mary resisted, then stalled, then cracked. After weeks of pressure, legal threats, isolation, and the growing threat of formal charges, she signed. It was the most traumatic political submission in her life. She admitted in writing that her parents' marriage had been unlawful, that she was not the lawful heir, that her father's supremacy over the Church of England was divinely ordained. In exchange, she was brought back to court. But it was a court she no longer recognized. The Mary who returned was cautious, politic, a version of herself edited by survival. She laughed when appropriate. She praised when necessary. But her core beliefs remained unshaken. She had capitulated publicly, but internally, she remained Catholic, remained convinced of her own legitimacy, and remained determined to restore the old order, if she ever got the chance. Henry, for his part, treated her with a kind of cold magnanimity. She was restored to the court, but not to the line of succession. When Jane Seymour bore him a son, Edward, Mary became, functionally, a historical footnote, still royal, still visible, but irrelevant. And yet, in the periphery of power, Mary became something else, a memory. To the conservatives, she was a symbol of the true faith. To the moderates, she was a cautionary tale. And to Henry, she was an error he had never fully corrected. His later efforts to reconcile with her, making her godmother to his children, inviting her to court functions, always stopped short of restoring her claim. It was the quiet, unresolved tension that haunted the Tudor court. What happens when a bastard still believes she's a princess? The answer wouldn't come until after Henry's death. In 1544, near the end of his reign, Henry passed the third act of succession, which placed Mary and Elizabeth back in the line of succession, but only after Edward and any of his heirs. It was a half measure, a safety valve, and it came with no restoration of legitimacy. Mary was still, officially, the king's bastard. But the stage was now set for the next generation of Tudor feuds. Because Mary's position was precarious not just by law, but by ideology. Edward, her half-brother, was being raised by Protestant reformers. Elizabeth, her half-sister, walked a delicate line of outward conformity and private calculation. And Mary? She remained unbending, unforgiven, and, most dangerously, unrepentant. Her feud with her father never truly ended. It simply went underground, stored up like a dormant fire in the heart of a daughter waiting for the day she could reclaim what had been stolen. Not just her crown, but her name, her church, and her mother's truth. And when that day came, the flames would be visible across England. Next, Edward VI versus Princess Mary, a brother and sister torn apart by gospel, succession, and the final war over the soul of the English Reformation. 18. Edward VI versus Princess Mary. In the history of Tudor feuds, the one between Edward VI and Princess Mary occupies a strange emotional register. It wasn't theatrical like Henry VIII's break with Catherine. It wasn't bloody in the traditional sense. But it was no less ruthless. It was a feud not between armies, but between ideologies, between bloodlines trying to rewrite themselves. And at its center were two half-siblings, both the children of a king who had shattered England's spiritual architecture, and both now determined to decide what would be built in its ruins. Edward VI, son of Henry VIII and Jane Seymour, was 9 years old when he became king in 1547. In portraits, he looks exactly as a Protestant reformer would want him to look. Pale, sharp-eyed, unflinching, and wise beyond his years. In reality, he was a sickly, bookish boy, fiercely devout, and deeply indoctrinated in the doctrines of Calvinist Protestantism. He was raised to see his kingship not merely as a role of governance, but as a divine mission to complete the religious revolution his father had started but never quite finished. This was the engine of his short reign, not war, not marriage, not lineage, but purification. He and his council would tear out every papist root, repaint every chapel wall, and replace every ritual with doctrine. And that put him on an immediate collision course with his older sister Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, still a devout Catholic, and still, in her own mind and in the minds of many, the rightful heir should Edward die without issue. At first their feud simmered under layers of civility. Edward was a child king, governed by a council of regents led first by his uncle Edward Seymour, and then by John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland. Mary, a royal adult with loyal supporters and a significant household, lived on her own estates, practicing her Catholic faith as quietly as possible, while refusing to recognize the religious changes imposed by Edward's government. But silence was not neutrality, and compliance was not loyalty. In 1549, the first open tension emerged. Edward's regime, increasingly emboldened in its Protestantism, passed new laws against the Catholic Mass. These were not symbolic reforms. They were punishable offenses. Mass was now banned in England. But Mary refused to stop holding it in her private chapels. This refusal was not just a personal preference. It was a political stance. By continuing to hear Mass, Mary was making a public declaration that she did not recognize the religious authority of her brother's government and that she was still her mother's daughter, still a subject of Rome in all but title. Edward and his council tried subtle pressure first. Letters, couriers, warnings. They asked her to comply quietly. She responded with the same stubborn tact her mother had used against Henry. She was polite, formal, unbending. And as always, her position was dangerous precisely because it was so reasonable. Mary didn't raise armies. She didn't call for rebellion. She simply refused to lie about what she believed. By 1550, the situation escalated. Ambassadors were dispatched to speak with her directly. When that failed, her servants were harassed, her chaplains interrogated, her household surveilled. Still, Mary would not bend. She now had foreign support again, notably from Charles V, her cousin and the Holy Roman Emperor, who threatened diplomatic consequences if Mary was mistreated. For Edward and his council, this turned Mary from an internal problem into a potential international incident. There was another layer of irony in all this. While Edward and Mary represented polar ends of the theological spectrum, their stubbornness came from the same place. They both saw religion as the foundation of political legitimacy. Edward believed that kings ruled by divine right to enforce the true faith, which to him meant Protestantism. Mary believed the same principle, but with Catholicism at its center. Both viewed compromise as betrayal, and neither trusted the other to rule without persecuting the truth. In 1551, the conflict reached its most intense stage. Edward's government began discussing whether Mary should be forcibly compelled to attend Protestant services. Arrest was considered. The plan was briefly in motion, but Charles V intervened again, warning that any mistreatment of Mary could lead to war. The English government blinked. Mary was allowed quietly to continue her private masses, but she was now more isolated than ever. Her household was reduced, her movements monitored, her allies at court diminished, and Edward, who had once doted on her as a sister, now saw her as a traitor in velvet. Their personal relationship deteriorated alongside the politics. In early 1553, during a rare face-to-face meeting, Edward and Mary argued bitterly over religion. According to contemporary reports, Edward shouted at her. Mary wept. The war had finally broken the emotional thread between them. What had once been affection, strained by politics, was now raw resentment, fueled by theological certainties. And then, just as the feud seemed poised to reach a breaking point, Edward's health collapsed. By the spring of 1553, it became clear that Edward was dying. He was 15. The boy king, groomed to lead a Protestant England into the future, had no children, no wife, and very little time. And that's when the feud took on its final, most dangerous shape. Edward's great fear was that Mary would succeed him and undo everything. Restore Catholicism, repeal the reforms, realign England with the Pope. He wasn't wrong. That was precisely what Mary intended to do, but Edward wasn't willing to leave it to fate. So he hatched a plan. Working with Northumberland, he drafted a new succession document, My Device for the Succession. In it, he bypassed both Mary and Elizabeth, who, though Protestant, was still technically illegitimate, and named Lady Jane Grey as his heir. Jane was a Protestant, intelligent, young, and crucially, married to Northumberland's son. She was also Edward's cousin, and while her claim to the throne was tenuous, it was good enough for a dying king desperate to keep his reformation alive. Edward died on July 6, 1553. 4 days later, Jane was proclaimed queen. Mary, caught off guard, responded with astonishing speed. She fled London, gathered her supporters, issued her own proclamations, and rallied both the nobility and the people to her cause. Within 9 days, Jane's support collapsed. The public, whatever their feelings about Mary's faith, recognized her as the lawful heir. Even many Protestants supported her, fearing that to deny her would invite chaos. On July 19th, Mary was proclaimed queen. Jane was imprisoned. Edward's attempt to engineer a Protestant succession had failed, and with it, the entire vision of a reformed England under a Protestant dynasty was suddenly in jeopardy. Mary, in ascending the throne, won the feud, but the victory came with impossible choices. Would she now undo her brother's religious changes? Would she punish those who had tried to bar her from the throne? Would she rule as a Catholic queen in a Protestant country? Or would she try to reconcile the factions? She chose the first path, and in doing so, launched one of the most polarizing reigns in English history. But at its core, her feud with Edward was not about personalities. It was about who defines truth in a kingdom torn between two versions of God. Edward died believing he had failed. Mary believed she had been vindicated. And England, caught between their competing visions, would spend the next generation lurching between altars and ashes. Next, Mary versus Lady Jane Grey and the Dudley Grey faction. When a 9-day queen becomes the figurehead of a dynastic gamble, and a Catholic monarch must choose between mercy, justice, and the ghosts of her brother's unfinished war. 19. Mary versus Lady Jane Grey and the Dudley Grey faction. The 9 days in July 1553 when Lady Jane Grey was nominally Queen of England are often described as a brief political accident, a footnote, or a tragic mistake. But that framing does a disservice to what actually happened. Jane's rise and fall wasn't just a botched succession, it was the terminal tremor of a long-brewing ideological earthquake. Behind the soft-focus portraits of the 9 Days Queen and the tragic Queen Mary stood a clash of succession, religious identity, and regime survival, with the entire Tudor experiment teetering on the edge. When Mary Tudor became queen in July 1553, it wasn't the result of dynastic inevitability. It was a coup in reverse. A usurped heir reclaiming her place not by inheritance alone, but by speed, strategic clarity, and public legitimacy. Her rival? A teenage girl thrust into power by a faction of political survivors who feared Mary not just as a Catholic but as a reckoning. Lady Jane Grey was not an ambitious pretender. She didn't want to be queen. She didn't campaign for it. She was, by most accounts, a highly intelligent, deeply pious young woman who had been groomed in the humanist and Protestant traditions. And she was perfectly placed, by blood, by temperament, and by vulnerability, to serve as the figurehead for an increasingly desperate Protestant regime. The architect of Jane's brief reign was John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, who had effectively ruled England during the last years of Edward VI's life. Dudley knew that with Edward dying and Mary next in line, the Protestant revolution he and the late king had engineered would not survive. Mary had made it clear, repeatedly, that she intended to restore Catholicism and the papal supremacy. If she succeeded, everything Dudley had built would be dismantled. The solution? Install a queen who could be controlled, whose Protestant faith was unquestionable, and whose claim, while not strong, could be papered over with urgency. Jane, the great-granddaughter of Henry VII through Mary Tudor, Henry VIII's younger sister, was positioned as Edward's chosen successor. The dying king, under Dudley's influence, had bypassed both Mary and Elizabeth in his will, citing their illegitimacy and Catholicism, and named Jane as his true heir. The plan was audacious. Jane was married off to Dudley's son, Guilford Dudley, in May 1553. Edward died in early July. Jane was declared queen on July 10th, and Mary, who had been watching events closely, immediately went into motion. Mary's response was swift and devastating. She fled to East Anglia, a region with strong Catholic sympathies and a well-established network of supporters. From there, She issued proclamations asserting her legitimacy and gathered a growing force of nobles and commoners. What began as a whisper campaign turned into a popular uprising. The council in London hesitated. The public began rallying to Mary. The navy defected. And the myth that Jane could command loyalty simply by being queen began to collapse. By July 19th, just 9 days after Jane had been crowned, the Privy Council switched sides. Mary was declared queen. Jane, Guildford, and the Dudleys were arrested and imprisoned in the Tower of London. Now Mary faced a problem of her own. What to do with Jane? Here's where the story darkens. By all reasonable measures, Lady Jane Grey was not a threat. She had no military command. She hadn't sought the crown. And she had surrendered peacefully. Many in Mary's court argued that Jane should be spared. And for a time, Mary agreed. Jane remained in the Tower, under relatively light guard. She was treated not as a political enemy, but as a pawn, an unfortunate casualty of other people's ambition. But then came Wyatt's rebellion in early 1554. The rebellion was sparked not by Jane, but by Mary's announcement that she would marry Philip of Spain, a Catholic foreign prince. English Protestants feared that Mary's marriage would drag England back into papal servitude and under Spanish influence. Sir Thomas Wyatt and other conspirators launched a rebellion to block the marriage and, in some versions of the plan, reinstate Jane as queen. Jane was not involved. She was still imprisoned, still under guard. But the mere fact that her name could be used as a rallying point changed everything. Mary, now under immense pressure from her Spanish advisors, from her own council, and from the need to demonstrate strength, made a brutal calculation. Jane could no longer live. On February 12, 1554, Lady Jane Grey and Guilford Dudley were executed. She died with dignity, famously reciting Psalm 51 and laying her head on the block with steady hands. The crowd that watched her execution was said to be silent, not out of fear, but out of mourning. A 17-year-old girl had been turned into a queen, then a criminal, and finally, a symbol of lost possibilities. Mary, for her part, believed she had acted justly. Jane had been a threat to national stability. Her name had been used in sedition, but that didn't make the choice any less heavy. Mary's reign had begun with blood, not of her enemies, but of her political mirror. Because Jane was, in so many ways, what Mary herself might have been. A princess displaced, a pawn used, a queen who reigned by the will of others. Their feud, if it can be called that, was asymmetrical. Mary was the executor. Jane was the sacrifice. But the conflict between them was a shadow play for the unfinished war between Protestant and Catholic, between succession by blood and succession by belief. Jane's death didn't resolve that war. It only paused it. Mary's reign would go on to see the Marian persecutions, the re-Catholicization of England, the burning of Protestant martyrs, and the gradual erosion of her popularity. But in those early days, the days of Lady Jane Grey, Mary made her most consequential choice that unity was more important than mercy, and in doing so she unknowingly ensured that her successor, a half-sister with a different faith and a longer memory, would take a very different path. Next, Elizabeth I versus Mary, Queen of Scots, when legitimacy becomes an international crisis, and two queens face off in a battle of faith, fear, and fatal letters. 20. Elizabeth I versus Mary, Queen of Scots. Few rivalries in royal history are as shrouded in moral ambiguity, religious paranoia, and political irony as the feud between Elizabeth I and Mary, Queen of Scots. It was a confrontation between two women who never met face to face, but whose shadows fell long and sharp across one another's lives. Theirs was not a war of battles, but of claims, letters, spies, and prisons. And the real tragedy? Each queen could have been what the other became, had they been born just slightly off schedule. Elizabeth was the daughter of Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII's controversial second wife, and for years had lived in the treacherous no-man's land of semi-legitimacy. Her mother had been executed. Her birth had triggered a constitutional revolution, and her claim to the throne was always suspect in the eyes of Catholic Europe. But Elizabeth had survived. She outmaneuvered politics, outlived her sister Mary I's bloody reign, and inherited the throne of a country gasping for stability. Meanwhile, Mary Stuart had been raised as a queen from cradle to crown. Granddaughter of Henry VII, through Margaret Tudor, Mary had a strong claim to the English throne, perhaps even stronger than Elizabeth's in the eyes of many Catholic monarchs. She was elegant, intelligent, and dangerously symbolic. In a Europe fractured by religion, she was the Catholic alternative to Elizabeth's Protestant experiment. And so, from the moment Elizabeth became queen in 1558, the game was on. Mary was Queen of Scotland, married to the French Dauphin, and living in the glittering court of Paris. Elizabeth was a new ruler, unmarried, the target of every scheming diplomat and religious reactionary on the continent. From the start, Elizabeth refused to name a successor. She feared it would make her a lame duck monarch, and she knew that doing so would immediately turn that person into a lightning rod for conspiracy. Yet Mary was already that lightning rod. By 1561, Mary returned to Scotland, newly widowed and newly ambitious. Scotland was Protestant now, largely thanks to John Knox and the Reformation, but Mary was a Catholic queen in a Protestant kingdom, which made her an awkward figure at home and a useful one abroad. For the next few years, she tried to manage the chaos. She remarried, disastrously, to Henry Lord Darnley, a weak man with strong ambitions and royal blood. Their union quickly devolved into scandal, suspicion, and finally murder. In 1567, Darnley was found dead in a garden after a mysterious explosion, and Mary soon married the chief suspect in the murder, James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell. The political fallout was immediate and total. Her Scottish nobles rebelled. Mary was imprisoned and forced to abdicate in favor of her infant son, James VI. She escaped, fled south, and walked straight into England. Here the feud finally turned personal. Elizabeth now had Mary in her custody. A living, breathing alternative monarch. Catholic queen with supporters across Europe, a potential successor, and a potential regicide in waiting. What do you do with a rival who can't be allowed to live freely, but also can't be legally condemned? You imprison her, and you keep her there for 19 years. Mary was moved from castle to castle, always under guard, always treated as a queen, but never allowed to leave. She became a symbol, not a woman. To Catholics, she was the true Queen of England, unjustly held. To Elizabeth, she was the sword of Damocles, always overhead, always glinting in the light of papal bulls and foreign ambassadors. The core problem was this: Mary would never renounce her claim to the English throne, and Elizabeth could never feel secure while she lived. Every Catholic uprising in the north, every foreign plot, every whisper of Spanish invasion, all roads led back to Mary. Even as she sat in stone rooms under polite surveillance, her name became a rallying cry for those who believed Elizabeth was illegitimate, her church heretical, and her government illegal. Then came the Babington Plot. In 1586, a group of Catholic conspirators, supported by Spain and the Jesuits, planned to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary on the throne. The letters between Mary and the plotters were intercepted by Francis Walsingham, Elizabeth's spymaster, who had long been building a case to neutralize Mary for good. The trap was elegant and cruel. Mary's letters were not just read, they were manipulated. Some were forged, others were planted. Eventually, Mary was led into writing a letter that seemed to approve the assassination. It was the final piece of evidence Elizabeth needed. But execution was not so simple. Killing Mary meant executing a fellow monarch. It set a precedent Elizabeth feared. If a queen could be put to death for political reasons, then no crown was safe. It also meant martyring Mary, giving Catholic Europe a symbol of Protestant tyranny. And Elizabeth, despite her ruthlessness, didn't want blood on her hands without cause. But the Babington Plot gave her cause. In 1587, After months of hesitation, political theater, and secretive back-channel debates, Mary was tried, found guilty of treason, and sentenced to death. Elizabeth signed the warrant, then claimed she hadn't meant for it to be carried out so quickly. Her ministers took the blame. History took the hint. Mary, Queen of Scots, was beheaded on February 8, 1587. Her execution was messy, symbolic, and loaded with political theater. She wore red, the color of Catholic martyrdom. Her final words were a prayer. And as the axe fell, the world changed. Elizabeth had removed her most persistent threat. But in doing so, she created a ghost. Mary's death gave Spain the final justification for war. In 1588, the Spanish Armada sailed for England, flying banners of vengeance and divine justice. It failed, of course, scattered by English ships in storms. But the point had been made. The death of Mary turned a cold war into an open one. And yet Elizabeth survived. Her reign stabilized. Protestantism was entrenched, and her cult of personality grew ever more radiant in contrast to the martyred queen she had killed. The irony, of course, is that Elizabeth's own successor would be Mary's son, James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England. The feud ended in blood, but it was buried in pragmatism. Elizabeth never named an heir, but everyone knew who it would be. Mary had lost the crown, lost the game, and lost her life. But her line inherited the throne anyway. Because in England, legitimacy is never about blood alone. It's about narrative. And Elizabeth's narrative was a triumph of order, reason, and stability. Mary's was a tragedy of faith, romance, and miscalculation. Next, Elizabeth I versus Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex. When a queen's favorite becomes her last great betrayal, and royal favor turns fatal. 21. Elizabeth I versus Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex. At first glance, the feud between Elizabeth I and Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, seems like the stuff of court gossip. A glamorous favorite, a powerful queen, and a tragic fall. But dig deeper, and what emerges is a story of generational dislocation, political exhaustion, and the limits of charisma in a world built on control. By the end of it, Elizabeth wasn't just dealing with a failed favorite. She was confronting the end of her own myth. Essex was born into privilege, but it was privilege with pressure. His stepfather had been Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, Elizabeth's closest companion, her supposed lover, and the man who had once been whispered as a potential king consort. After Dudley's death in 1588, Essex inherited both his place at court and the weight of expectations that came with it. He was everything Elizabeth's aging counsel wasn't. Young, bold, romantic, and theatrical. He had flair, he had presence, he understood the performance of power, how to bow just low enough, speak just loud enough, and fight just bravely enough to be noticed. He quickly became a favorite of the Queen, who by this point was in her mid-50s and surrounded by men 30 years her junior. But Essex wasn't just a court pet. He had ambitions. He saw himself as a man born to command, to conquer, to rescue England from indecision and decadence. He wanted to be a new Leicester, a new Raleigh, a new Sydney. But most of all, he wanted to be indispensable. The trouble was, Elizabeth didn't want indispensable men. By the 1590s, Elizabeth's reign was creaking under the weight of its own longevity. The old guard, Cecil, Walsingham, Knollys, was dying off or fading. The war with Spain dragged on. Ireland remained defiantly ungovernable, and the Queen, though still sharp, was increasingly isolated. Essex saw this as opportunity. He believed he could step in where others had failed, push the crown to take more aggressive stances, and carve out a legacy of his own. At first, Elizabeth indulged him. She gave him honors, titles, and even lucrative monopolies. But she also kept him on a short leash. Essex wanted war. Elizabeth wanted stability. Essex wanted glory. Elizabeth wanted survival. And as time wore on, the Queen began to see in Essex not just promise, but threat. The key turning point came with the Irish campaign of 1599. Ireland had long been England's ulcer. The Earl of Tyrone was leading a major rebellion, and previous efforts to crush it had failed spectacularly. Essex convinced Elizabeth to give him command of the expedition. He would go to Ireland, defeat Tyrone, and return a hero. But that's not what happened. Instead, Essex bungled the campaign. He delayed. He negotiated. He distributed command among allies. And worst of all, when the pressure mounted, he abandoned his post and raced back to England, without permission. To understand the severity of that move, you have to understand Elizabeth's court. Everything ran on hierarchy, ritual, and consent. For a subject, even a favored one, to return to court without the Queen's explicit recall was more than rash. It was insubordination. Essex burst into the Queen's chambers disheveled and unannounced. The moment became the stuff of legend. Some said Elizabeth, aging and unadorned, was horrified to be seen in her informal state. Others claimed Essex knelt and wept. What is certain is this: it marked the beginning of his end. He was placed under house arrest. His political opponents, long irritated by his arrogance, began circling. His monopolies were revoked. His income dried up. And still, he believed he could win back her favor. That he was irreplaceable. He wasn't. By early 1601, Essex's desperation had curdled into delusion. He convinced himself that a faction at court, led by Robert Cecil, was poisoning the Queen's mind against him. He believed the country would rise in his defense if only he made a move. So he made a move. On February 8, 1601, Essex and a small band of followers tried to seize London. It was a farcical coup attempt. The city did not rise. The people did not rally. His supporters hesitated. Within hours, Essex was arrested. The trial was swift. He was charged with treason. During his defense, he wavered between defiance and self-pity. But the outcome was inevitable. Elizabeth, though deeply affected, could not let it stand. A subject, especially a favored one, had raised arms against her government. And so, on February 25th, Essex was executed. It wasn't just the end of Essex. It was the end of something else, too. Elizabeth never really recovered. Her later years were marked by melancholy, by silence, by the slow dimming of court life. The golden icon of Gloriana became a tired, sorrowful monarch. She spoke less. She withdrew more. She left more decisions to others. Some say she never again wore the ring that Essex had once given her. Their feud wasn't about ideology or succession. It was about disillusionment, about a queen who outlived her illusions and a favorite who mistook attention for power. Essex thought Elizabeth needed rescuing, but she didn't want a rescuer. She wanted obedience. And in punishing him, she reinforced a truth that had defined her reign from the beginning. The crown is not sentimental. Next, James II versus Mary II and William of Orange. When a father's faith becomes his undoing, and a royal daughter helps rewrite the monarchy by replacing her own blood. 22. James II versus Mary II and William of Orange. In the long catalogue of English royal feuds, few are as constitutionally radioactive as the conflict between James II and his daughter Mary II, aided and abetted by her politically astute husband, William of Orange. This wasn't just a falling out over court titles or inheritance. This was a full-scale dynastic coup led by one royal generation against another. It reset the monarchy, rewrote the rules of succession, and sent one king into exile while inviting a foreign prince to take his place. And it all happened in part because a baby was born. James II, younger brother of Charles II, had taken the throne in 1685, already carrying a heavy burden. He was openly Catholic in a country that had spent a century waging theological war with itself. The restoration of the monarchy had only barely patched over the religious divides left by the civil wars, Cromwell, and the Protectorate. England could accept a king again, but only if he understood that certain lines were not to be crossed. James crossed them almost immediately. He believed in divine right monarchy. That wasn't unusual. But he also believed he could reinterpret laws, override Parliament, and stack government offices with Catholics. He tried to repeal the Test Acts, which excluded Catholics from public office, issued the Declaration of Indulgence, which suspended penal laws against both Catholics and Protestant dissenters, and pursued a deliberate strategy of converting England's ruling class by royal fiat. For a while, his Protestant subjects held their breath. Maybe he was just overreaching. Maybe the balance of power would hold. After all, he had no male heir. Only 2 Protestant daughters. Mary, married off to the staunchly Protestant William of Orange in the Netherlands, and Anne, also safely Protestant. The unspoken hope was that when James died, the crown would pass to Mary, and England could slide back into Protestant comfort. Then came June 1688. James's Catholic wife gave birth to a son, James Francis Edward Stuart, a healthy baby boy, a direct male heir. And for the first time in decades, the real possibility emerged of a Catholic dynasty returning to dominate English politics for generations. The Protestants panicked. This is the moment when the family feud turned into political revolution. Mary, living in the Dutch Republic, had long remained silent about her father's policies, but William, already a seasoned politician and military leader, saw the opening. He was invited, yes, formally invited, by a group of English nobles and churchmen to come to England and rescue the country from what they described as an unlawful regime. William didn't need much convincing. He was already locked in continental struggles with France and saw control of England as essential to containing Louis XIV. A Protestant England aligned with Dutch interests? Irresistible. So in November 1688, William landed at Torbay with 15,000 troops. It wasn't an invasion in the traditional sense. It was more like a highly staged intervention. As William advanced, support for James evaporated. Nobles defected. Army officers switched sides. Even James's own daughter, Princess Anne, abandoned him. James faltered. He tried to rally support, then hesitated, then tried to flee. He was captured, then allowed to escape to France, in what many believe was deliberately arranged to avoid the messy optics of executing or imprisoning a king. By January 1689, James was gone, and Parliament declared that he had abdicated by fleeing the country. But here's where the constitutional magic trick happens. Rather than crown Mary alone, Parliament declared that William and Mary would rule jointly. 2 monarchs, ruling as one. But William would exercise most of the actual power. This was not a restoration. It was a reinvention. The new monarchs accepted the Declaration of Rights, later formalized as the Bill of Rights, 1689. It explicitly limited royal prerogative, banned Catholic succession, reaffirmed Parliament's authority over taxation and laws, and prohibited a standing army without parliamentary consent. It was, for all intents and purposes, the beginning of constitutional monarchy as we know it. The feud between James and Mary wasn't just personal, it was generational. It pitted absolutism against parliamentary sovereignty, divine right against conditional monarchy, and familial loyalty against national stability. Mary reportedly wept when she took the throne. She had deposed her own father, but she also believed she was saving her country. James, meanwhile, became the figurehead of the Jacobite movement, a network of royalist, Catholic, and anti-parliamentarian sympathizers who would spend the next 60 years trying to restore his line. The first of these attempts came in 1689 to 90, with James landing in Ireland and attempting to regain his crown by military force. William met him at the Battle of the Boyne in 1690 and crushed the rebellion. James fled again, this time for good. What started as a clash of values ended as an institutional revolution. Mary died young in 1694 without children. William ruled alone until his death in 1702. The throne passed to Anne, Mary's sister, under the new Protestant-only rules. James's line, the Old Pretender, and later Bonnie Prince Charlie, would go on to stage romantic but doomed uprisings. But the damage had been done, and the monarchy had been changed. The glorious revolution, as it came to be called, wasn't glorious because it was bloodless, it wasn't, nor because it was noble, it was mostly opportunistic. It was glorious because it gave birth to a new idea, that monarchs reign not by heaven's fiat, but by the consent of the governed. And it all started when a daughter and a son-in-law decided they could run the country better than the king himself. Next, the Hanoverian monarchy versus James Francis. Edward Stuart, when the ghosts of 1688 return in exile and dynastic memory becomes a weapon of resistance. 23. The Hanoverian monarchy versus James Francis, Edward Stuart. By the early 18th century, England had already decapitated one king, deposed another, and imported a pair of monarchs from across the sea. So when George I arrived from Hanover in 1714, barely speaking English and barely interested in British customs, it was less a shock than a shrug. But for a not insignificant part of the population, George wasn't their king at all. The real monarch, they insisted, was in exile, a man known to history as the Old Pretender, and to his supporters simply as James III. James Francis Edward Stuart was the son of James II, the Catholic monarch ousted during the Glorious Revolution of 1688. Born in 1688 under a cloud of suspicion and propaganda, there were rumors he was smuggled into the royal birth chamber in a warming pan. James grew up in the shadow of a crown he was told was rightfully his. He was raised in France, educated in exile, and groomed for a throne he would never sit on. But he had one powerful asset: memory. The Jacobite cause, named after the Latin for James, Jacobus, became a rallying point for anyone disillusioned with the post-1688 political order. And while many of these grievances were wrapped in romantic language about divine right and hereditary legitimacy, they also reflected deeper unrest about the nature of monarchy, religion, and national identity. The problem, from the Jacobite point of view, was that the Hanoverians had no poetic legitimacy. George I was a pragmatic solution to a Protestant succession crisis. He was chosen by Parliament because he was Protestant and distantly descended from James I. But he had no real roots in English culture or politics. And that void became the entry point for Jacobite nostalgia. In 1715, James Francis Edward Stuart made his move. The opportunity was ripe. Queen Anne had died in 1714, and George I had only just arrived. The transition had been smooth on paper but fraught beneath the surface. In the north, especially in Scotland, loyalty to the Stuarts still ran deep. And so, the first major Jacobite rising began. The 1715 Rising, also known as the 15, was an awkward blend of nostalgia and miscalculation. The rebellion in Scotland was led by the Earl of Mar, who raised the Stuart standard and gathered a sizable force. In England, sympathizers stirred but ultimately hesitated. James himself delayed his arrival, and when he finally landed, it was with little energy and even less tactical clarity. The Scottish Jacobites won a few skirmishes, but failed to take key strongholds. The English Jacobites were easily scattered, and James, rather than rallying his forces or inspiring confidence, appeared almost resigned. When government troops advanced, he slipped away, back to France, leaving behind the shattered hopes of his supporters. The Hanoverian response was swift and unforgiving. Rebels were executed or exiled. The state cracked down on potential sympathizers. And George I, while hardly beloved, was now secure. But the story didn't end there. James Francis Edward continued to plot, fundraise, and issue manifestos. And while he never again came close to seizing power, his continued presence in exile gave the Jacobite cause a mythic continuity. He became a living symbol of the alternate path not taken, a mirror version of monarchy in which legitimacy came from bloodline and divine right, not from parliamentary decree. For the Hanoverians, this feud was less about one man than about controlling the narrative. They portrayed James as a foreign-backed agitator, a Catholic puppet of France and Rome. Propaganda painted him as dangerous, inept, or both. But the real threat wasn't James himself. It was what he represented, the enduring idea that the 1688 settlement could be reversed. The feud would be passed down to the next generation. James's son, Charles Edward Stuart, better known as Bonnie Prince Charlie, would lead the far more famous Jacobite uprising of 1745. And while that's a different chapter entirely, the core of the conflict remained the same. Two visions of monarchy, one born in exile, the other in law. What the Hanoverian versus Jacobite feud reveals is that even in a post-revolutionary England, the past never stays buried. James Francis Edward Stuart never ruled, never commanded a decisive battle, and never built a government. But his very existence kept alive the possibility that England might one day wake up and realize it had crowned the wrong kings. In the end, it didn't. The Hanoverians held on. Parliament entrenched its supremacy. The monarchy continued, now bound in new chains of accountability and Protestant conformity. But for a few brief years, the ghosts of 1688 were not just haunting the crown. They were knocking on the door. Next, George III versus George, Prince of Wales. When monarchy meets madness and a son waits in the wings while the crown itself starts to fracture. 24. George III versus George, Prince of Wales. It is one of the more awkward traditions of monarchy, naming your heir after yourself and then spending decades locked in passive-aggressive warfare with him. For George III and George, Prince of Wales, this tradition reached its high point, or perhaps its lowest depth, in a public, performative, and deeply dysfunctional rivalry that threatened to tear the British monarchy apart during an age already teetering on revolution. This feud was not about dynastic legitimacy. There were no rival claims or competing religions, no coups, no uprisings. It was something far simpler. A father and son who despised each other, each believing the other was unfit to rule. And as Britain careened through the late 18th and early 19th centuries, their hostility became a national crisis, wrapped in powdered wigs and royal ceremony. Let's start with the father. George III came to the throne in 1760, young, serious, and obsessed with duty. He styled himself as a moral monarch, the kind who would embody virtue and resist the corruption he saw in court culture. He married a German princess, Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, and astonishingly for the time, remained faithful to her. He had 15 children. He read books. He tried to lead by example. But George III had his flaws. He was stubborn, inflexible, and deeply suspicious of political dissent. He took an almost paternal interest in Parliament, often trying to direct policy from behind the scenes. His reign saw the loss of the American colonies, war with revolutionary France, and long periods of economic instability. And beginning in the 1780s, he began to suffer from bouts of mental illness that would later become the stuff of historical and cinematic fascination. At the time, though, they were poorly understood and politically explosive. Enter the son. George, Prince of Wales, later George IV, was everything his father wasn't: flamboyant, indulgent, extravagant, and politically mercurial. While his father preached duty, the prince cultivated a lifestyle of luxurious rebellion. He surrounded himself with artists, writers, and fashionistas. He drank heavily. He gambled excessively. He accumulated massive debts, which Parliament was routinely pressured to cover. And, most controversially, in 1785, he married a Catholic widow, Maria Fitzherbert, in secret. An act that, had it been public, would have made him ineligible for the throne under the Royal Marriages Act and the Act of Settlement. George III was, predictably, enraged. He refused to recognize the marriage, blocked any chance of making it official, and increased restrictions on his son's influence. Meanwhile, the prince sulked, mocked his father in private correspondence, and began building his own political faction in opposition to the king's preferred ministers. By 1788, the situation boiled over. George III suffered a major mental health crisis, likely brought on by porphyria, though that diagnosis remains debated. He rambled, he foamed, he could not function. And suddenly the question of governance became urgent. Should the Prince of Wales be declared regent? Should he be given full royal powers while his father recovered, if he recovered at all? Would this not be, essentially, a soft coup? Parliament was split. Whigs backed the prince. Tories held out for the king. After months of debate, a regency bill was drawn up, one that would have given George limited powers. But just as the bill was about to pass, George III recovered, much to the dismay of his son, who had already begun measuring the royal drapes. The feud entered a new, colder phase. Father and son now circled each other like rivals in a domestic Cold War. The prince publicly played the part of loyal heir while privately resenting every constraint. George III, for his part, became increasingly disillusioned with his son's lifestyle and judgment. When the prince finally married, this time officially, Caroline of Brunswick in 1795, it was under pressure from Parliament, and the union quickly collapsed. The two loathed each other almost immediately. Their only child, Princess Charlotte, became a kind of pawn in the ongoing war, a potential heir beloved by the public and a rare figure who inspired affection from both George. In 1810, the king suffered a second, more permanent mental collapse, triggered by the death of his favorite daughter, Princess Amelia. This time, there would be no recovery. And so, in 1811, the long-awaited regency finally began. George, Prince of Wales, now became Prince Regent, wielding royal power in everything but name. He was at last in control, and the country braced for what that would mean. What it meant, in practice, was a reign marked by aesthetic excess and political ambiguity. The Prince Regent was a patron of the arts. He commissioned the Royal Pavilion at Brighton, indulged in elaborate banquets, and elevated British fashion. But he also continued to alienate political allies, engage in petty vendettas, and spend public money with breathtaking abandon. He became a caricature of aristocratic decadence, a sharp contrast to the rising middle-class values of restraint and industry. And though he nominally supported reform early in his career, by the 1810s he had aligned himself with the conservative establishment. George III, now blind, deaf, and mentally unwell, lived out his final years in Windsor Castle, isolated from politics and family. He died in 1820. The prince, now 57, finally became George IV. By that point, the public had long since tired of him. His reign would be short, and though he presided over important moments, like the Catholic Emancipation Act in 1829, he did so reluctantly and under duress. What this feud left behind was a monarchy permanently altered by personal dysfunction. It exposed the vulnerabilities of a system that relied on the stability of individuals, and it gave rise to the precedent that mental or physical incapacity could justify a transfer of power within the monarchy, even without formal abdication. In a way, both men lost. George III lost control of his legacy. George IV lost the public's affection. But their rivalry helped define the transition of the British monarchy from an institution of absolute symbolic power to one increasingly tethered to public accountability and constitutional norms. Next, Edward VIII versus the Crown's constitutional system, when love, politics, and public duty collide, and the throne itself becomes negotiable. 25. Edward VIII versus the Crown's constitutional system, and the future George VI. In the long lineage of English monarchs, some died on the battlefield, some were deposed, some lost their minds. But Edward VIII did something far rarer. He walked away, and in doing so, he triggered a constitutional crisis that would ripple through the monarchy for decades to come. On paper, this feud was not as bloody or dramatic as the Plantagenet disputes, nor as ideological as the Glorious Revolution. But it was, in some ways, more corrosive. It pitted a modern monarch's desire for personal freedom against an ancient institution's demand for restraint. It was less about war and more about the image of monarchy. And in the end, it exposed just how fragile the crown had become in a world shaped by media, public opinion, and politics. Edward VIII came to the throne in January 1936, following the death of his father, George V. He was charismatic, cosmopolitan, and intensely modern. He dressed impeccably, moved in elite transatlantic social circles, and had a natural ease with the public. But behind the charm was a restless, impatient man who saw the trappings of monarchy as an inconvenient antique. From the start, he made it clear he wanted to do things differently. He refused to follow court protocol. He clashed with ministers. He spoke openly about political matters, to the horror of his advisors. But most significantly, he had long been romantically involved with an American divorcee named Wallis Simpson. To say this was controversial would be a spectacular understatement. Wallis was twice divorced and still technically married to her second husband when her relationship with Edward became public. Under Church of England doctrine, the monarch could not marry a divorced person if their former spouse was still alive, and Edward, as supreme governor of that church, could not both marry Wallis and remain king. The government, led by Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, was clear the marriage was unacceptable. The Dominions, especially Canada and Australia, also signaled their opposition. Parliament would not support it. The Archbishop of Canterbury denounced it. The press, at first cautious, soon joined in. For the establishment, this wasn't about love. It was about duty, about appearances, about monarchy as a symbol of moral stability, especially at a time when fascism was on the rise in Europe. But Edward would not back down. He insisted he could not reign without Wallis by his side. He floated the idea of a morganatic marriage, one in which Wallis would not become queen. But this, too, was rejected. The conflict escalated. Advisors begged him to choose the crown. He refused. And so, on December 11, 1936, less than a year into his reign, Edward VIII became the first English monarch to voluntarily abdicate the throne. He announced it in a radio broadcast that has since become infamous. "I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love." The crown passed to his younger brother Albert, who reluctantly became George VI. A shy, stammering man, George was the opposite of Edward in almost every way. But where Edward had charisma, George had gravitas. He stepped into the breach with quiet determination, stabilizing the monarchy and becoming a symbol of endurance during the Second World War. The feud between Edward and the crown didn't end with abdication. It morphed into something more complicated, a family and institutional estrangement. Edward was granted the title Duke of Windsor, but his relationship with the royal family became frosty. He and Wallis married in France in 1937, without any senior royals in attendance. Worse still, Edward's post-abdication behavior raised further questions about his judgment. He fraternized with Nazi officials during visits to Germany. He gave interviews that appeared sympathetic to Hitler. He was appointed governor of the Bahamas during the war, a distant and symbolic post designed to keep him out of European politics. Meanwhile, George VI struggled with the burden he had inherited. He worked tirelessly to uphold the image of the monarchy, even as he battled ill health and the psychological weight of being Plan B. His daughters, including the future Elizabeth II, grew up in a household still shadowed by the abdication crisis. What Edward never fully grasped was that kingship was not a prize but a performance. It was a role, a job, one that required sacrifice, not self-expression. In choosing personal happiness over institutional duty, he inadvertently proved how deeply that duty mattered. The monarchy survived, but it did not forget. Edward lived out the rest of his life in relative obscurity, visiting England only occasionally. He died in 1972. He was buried near his family, but his story remained an outlier, a cautionary tale told in hushed tones. And yet, his abdication had long-lasting consequences. It reshaped the line of succession, placing George VI on the throne and ultimately making Elizabeth II queen. It reinforced the principle that monarchy must adapt or perish, and it set a precedent for how the crown responds to individual desire clashing with constitutional necessity. In the end, Edward got the woman he loved, but he lost everything else. The feud he started wasn't just with his brother or the church or parliament, it was with the very concept of monarchy itself. And the crown, despite the crisis, emerged more cautious, more guarded, and paradoxically, more powerful in its restraint. Thus ends our tour through 25 royal feuds that didn't just mark history, they made it. These were not mere family squabbles. They were the tectonic clashes that redrew the borders of power, redefined monarchy, and revealed just how thin the line can be between royal grandeur and royal disaster. Because if there's one lesson the British monarchy has taught us over and over again, it's this. Blood is thicker than water, but not thicker than politics.